Now.
Okay, it announced that you're recording.
All righty. Hey, everyone. This is Nevin, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. And with me is a very special guest who I've been periodically in touch with. He's been a bit of an intellectual mentor for me. His name is Dr. Pat Choate. Dr. Choate, or we'll just call Dr. Choate, Pat, is a He's a little bit of a celebrity, I might add, too, as well. He was a former vice presidential candidate in 1996 on the ticket with the Reform Party presidential candidate H. Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire, investor, entrepreneur, and visionary. He is a prolific author, too, as well. I have some of Pat's books, like Agents of Influence. These are from my personal library here. Dangerous Business, and Saving Capitalism. All excellent books, which helped shape my economic views from more of a laissez-faire, liberal or libertarian or Reaganomics approach, more towards what I term balanced and nationalist capitalism, and the ideas of what I also like to term shared but earned prosperity. Scholars such as Pat have also influenced me in directions along with good old common sense, the view, what I term the 6 sources of national wealth, which is manufacturing, mining, agriculture, research and development, transportation, and all other forms of infrastructure. So Pat, along with others like William R. Hawkins, Alan Tonelson, a variety of different people, Don McIlvaney, Anthony Harrigan, and various other, Robert Reich and others spanning the left and the right and the center, have really, because of the sheer strength of their data, has allowed me to somewhat shift my economic views while still staying within the framework of free enterprise and competition. Now, Pat has also served on a number of federal commissions dealing with economics, including trade policy, infrastructure since at least the 1980s. Pat has also been involved in the private sector in accomplished positions, notably as one of the vice presidents of TRW during most of the 1980s. Pat has also networked with a variety of other figures in the political world. Another figure who I admire greatly, who has affected my worldviews in many ways, Michael Lind, and has worked with many, many organizations across the spectrum on rebuilding the American economy, rebuilding American industry, and making us truly a wealth-producing country. And that's the important thing. Pat understands the problems of what he terms market absolutism and excessive reliance on what he terms the money industry as being the engine of the economy. So after this very long-winded introduction, welcome to the show, Pat, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the generous introduction. It's good being with you.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot to talk about. I think we're going to have many extended conversations as events unfold in this country, especially with a new incoming administration and Republican congressional majority. Now, this is going to be, of course, we're going to start out with who you are, who, what, where, and why. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate more, to take leaving off where with my introduction. I wanted to allow you to introduce more of your political work and your work for the federal government and TRW, which I kind of touched on the introduction. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. I grew up on a farm just south of Dallas, Ellis County, Waxahachie, Red Oak, Maypearl, that area of the country. I went to a public school, Red Oak school system. went to the University of Texas at Arlington, got my bachelor's in economics, got my master's and PhD at the University of Oklahoma. Then I was commissioned into the Army, went into the retired reserves. In Oklahoma, doing my doctorate, I was my major professor is a man named W. Nelson Peach, who wrote what was then the principal economics principles of economics textbook used for entering college students. He also wrote a book called World Resources that he did an update of Eric W. Zimmerman. And so I began my career working as a research assistant to Dr. Nelson Peach. And it was a very different era, 60 years ago, in that your major professor virtually adopted you. So you'd have dinner with the family 3 or 4 nights a week. And it was intimate discussions that he was doing a revision of his principles textbook. And so it would be one of the things he would have me read a chapter as he finished it, and then explain the chapter back to him, which was a useful exercise. He wanted to see if it was being communicated. And it's a great way to learn economics from somebody that's writing economics textbook. When I finished that, I was hired by the state of Oklahoma, Governor Henry Bellman. He had a newly created Department of Industrial Development. So I went to work with him, and then his successor, Dewey Bartlett. Both of them went to the U.S. Senate. And my job there was Director of Research for the Industrial Development Department and State Planner. And so while there, and part of the arrangement is I did my doctoral dissertation, which was an economic plan for Oklahoma. And so my doctoral dissertation became the state development plan. From there, I wound up doing the same thing for the state of Tennessee. I was the first commissioner of development. I put together the Tennessee development plan, which was very controversial at the time because I saw this massive investment coming from abroad. You had many states that did not want it, and I saw the job potential, and so Tennessee focused on that. It's done very well. From there, I went to the Department of Commerce. I ran the Economic Development Administration's regional office in Appalachia, 5 states, and Huntington, West Virginia, and then the 8 states in the southern United States. And then from there, I ran the Office of Economic Research, where I had a staff of PhD economists and just simply studied economics. From there, I went for 10 years for TRW. I was first senior analyst, then I was vice president of policy. TRW was an international conglomerate that subsequently got broken up. But at that point, it was in several different industries. It owned 75 companies. It was worldwide. And I was in the office as an assistant to the CEO, Dr. Reuben Mettler. And my job at that point was to identify and let me turn off this phone so it doesn't interrupt us again.
No problem. No problem.
So my job there was to take a look at what was happening in the world, the U.S., understand trends, and see what needs to be done. And so that's what I did for 10 years there. I wrote a book called High Flex Society, basically making the argument that our system was becoming sclerotic. It was freezing up. It was people couldn't shift jobs, weren't getting training as such. I did another book with Governor Cuomo's chief economist, Gail Garfield Schwartz, called Being Number One, Advocating Industrial Policies. So I did that, and Dr. Mettler left in 89 and 1990. I left TRW, created a think tank, a small think tank with a handful of people, and that's been my base ever since. I've written books, done studies, done testimony. My whole focus is very much fact based. I'm an institutionalist. I'm an institutional economist. I really have focused on a framework that says the economy is really measured in three ways. It's propelled forward. It's productive in three things. One is labor, your human stock. The second is the capital, your financial resources, and third is technology. There's Robert Solow and others have done studies trying to calculate the contributions that each of those factors have made. And basically, a technological advancement is the driving force and has been the driving force in this country, combined with training and educating the American people. Most people don't realize we had a higher literacy rate in this country before the Civil War than what we have now. This is a country that has always believed in the benefits of education. We created the public education system. We've trained people. We have infinite hope that people can learn and contribute to do that. We have regulated our finance up until recent years. And when we do that, what we've had is, and what we've wanted, is the finance to be focused on productive uses, not speculation, as we have now. One of the great failures of of a couple of administrations was to do away with Glass-Steagall, a reform that was put in by Franklin Roosevelt. It was a reform that said people's deposits, people's savings that were held by bank were held in trust, and that a bank or a financial institution could not take those funds, leverage them, and use them for speculative activities. That could only be done with capital or money that they had. That was their money. They had it had to be their money that they're gambling on. And Bill Clinton, his last act as president was to eliminate Glass-Steagall. That led to gambling very quickly in the financial market. And less than 8 years, we had the Great Recession of 2008. So basically, what I have done is looked at parts of the economy. In my books, I've looked at infrastructure. I've looked at technology. I've looked at trade. I've looked at training on the human capital. I've looked at the financial sector. And basically, my books are to try to find ways to make that system work more efficiently. I've also taken a look at the politics of this, the influence, the Washington swamp as such, its role and influence, and of course it's been out of control. And a major reason for that traces back to the reforms that were made after Watergate, 1974, in the way that we allowed money into the system. And then you've had a couple of Supreme Court decisions culminating in Citizens United that allows massive amounts of dark money to pervade our system. And so we've basically turned over a good part of the control of our political system to billionaires, dark money, foreign money as such. And so that was part of the impetus of agents of influence, is how dark money, foreign governments affect the national policies of the United States. Right now, I'm noodling and working on the question of the trade system, which is working very much against the interest of this country, of what are some of the reasons economically that we're disadvantaged. And the big conclusion, as you and I've talked off camera before, is the pervasiveness of the use of the value-added tax. 170 other countries use a value-added tax, and We can get into it later if you wish. But it has been weaponized against the United States, creating subsidies for foreign manufacturers and creating tariff-like barriers against American exports. And so over, I think, the next several months, maybe a year or two, I'm going to be focusing and working on that, perhaps do a small book on it.
Oh, excellent. That's all great information. And what I'm seeing here is you have a tremendous amount of life experience. You served in the state and federal agencies, TRW, writing books, starting a think tank. We all know people, members of my audience, you can Google Bat Choate. He's all over YouTube. You can find his interviews with Michael Lynn, speeches even before various state agencies, legislatures. You can even find the videos of you giving interviews to staff of the now defunct organization Economy for Crisis, who a few essays of mine years ago were even published, as a matter of fact. So you have quite an experience. Now, let's get into a couple of things. I think you're dead on with all the facts that you've laid before. The deregulation, or sometimes what I like to term it crony deregulation, to favor one interest over another, has really started, from a historical point of view, started under President Carter with the deregulation of trucking and airlines, and the abolition by the 1980s of the Civilian Aeronautics Board, or CAB, and the view that it was going to provide better service and more competition. But over time, did that really drive down prices or really enhance service even more?
Yeah. It cartelized the industry. It went just the opposite of what they were stated to do, what they were trying to do.
Correct. And even Barry Goldwater even complained about that in an editorial back in the early 1980s. And he was very critical and highlighted how the deregulation, whatever the intentions, actually affected even safety requirements in the airlines, let alone also service and ensuring healthy competition. I don't have the essay right in front of me, or the article. It was in one of the major East Coast newspapers, if I recall. I can't recall if it was the Washington Post or New York Times. When you take a look at, of course, it accelerated under Ronald Reagan. It accelerated under Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump. The deregulation of leverage buyouts, as we know in the audit. Well, you know this, of course. Hostile takeovers or leverage buyouts, and there are differing terms for the same thing. Now it's known as private equity. That used to be either severely regulated or even illegal. There were state-level anti-takeover laws which were struck down by the Supreme Court, which was becoming more corporate-friendly under Lewis Powell, the former Chief Justice. You also have anti-usury laws that were also tightly enforced on a state level, and that was also declared I don't know if it was probably unconstitutional in 1978. And then, of course, you have the the savings and loans industry that was deregulated under Reagan, and that had unfortunate results by the late 1980s. You also have Bill Clinton, as you mentioned, getting rid of Glass-Steagall, which was being chipped away starting under Ronald Reagan. There have been histories of Glass-Steagall of banking that have really traced that to Carter, Reagan, Walter Wriston, who was the president of one of America's biggest banks. I think it was Citibank. Was very much involved in the push to get rid of Glass-Steagall. So you see this on and on and on. And of course, Clinton put the cherry on the sundae in the year 2000 in passing what is termed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. And this is a bipartisan work. This is not just one party. It's basically this neoliberalism which afflicted both the Democratic as well as the Republican parties, with some exceptions, of course. And it was really a kind of a bipartisan effort to financialize the economy. And part of that was because of belief that we were entering a post-industrial society. Part of it was really just cronyism and extreme amounts of lobbying with a liberalized anti-lobbying and campaign finance rules, many different things. And they packaged it with a heavy layer of mathematics, at least on the economist side. And that kind of gave a veneer that it was reputable and respectable. And I think that helped kind of stymie more resistance to these policies. So there's a lot at work. And before I ask my next question, and this is just kind of the buttress where you're saying I have one of my Substack papers open, and you had people who formally believed in this speak out. You have in an October 2008 speech at Grand Valley State University, L. William Seidman, who is the former chairman of the FDIC under President George Bush and an ally and friend of Alan Greenspan, said the problem was that there was no regulatory for these, and it was proposed that regulation at least would be required in regards to derivatives and whatnot. So he was very critical of that. I'm not going to read the quote, but even Greenspan himself admitted in congressional testimony after the financial crisis in 2008, he said, those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked belief. In 2008, the ardently pro-deregulation Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Christopher Cox, who, by the way, another guest and friend of the program, actually met and lobby Christopher Cox on behalf of California business interests against NAFTA and was unsuccessful. Chris Cox seemed to be a bit of a true believer. I don't know him. He might have been corrupt too as well. I can't say either way. So Christopher Cox himself testified to the Senate Banking Committee that deregulation failed the American financial industry. He called for the reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act and re-regulation of the credit swap market. Cox stated before the Senate, there is another similar regulatory hole that must be immediately addressed to avoid similar consequences. The $58 trillion national market in credit default swaps, double the amount outstanding in 2006, is regulated by no one. Neither the SEC nor any regulator has authority over the CDS, or that's the acronym for those of you who don't know of credit default swaps, market, even to require minimal disclosure to the market. So their failure, he says further, the failure of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act to give regulatory authority over investment bank holding companies to any agency of government was, based on the experience of the last several months, a costly mistake. And before I go to my next question, I also like to ask the how and the why. What is the personalities, the psychology, the decision making? What is involved in a large part of the financial services industry? This is where I depart from the toxic forms of populism and anti-capitalism, as well as the conspiracy crowd, the anti-New World Order conspiracy crowd. They don't look, in my opinion, with all due respect, in really the deeper issues that play a deeper analysis. So one of the things I think to kind of edify the audience, I think, I've mentioned this before in my writings as well as on previous shows. There's a really good article written by Sam Polk, who was a former wealthy hedge fund trader for the New York Times. And in the article, Polk recalled that he worked elbow to elbow with billionaires. I was a giant fireball of greed. I'd think about how my colleagues could buy Micronesia if they wanted to, or become mayor of New York City. They didn't just have money, they had power. Power beyond getting a table at Le Bernardin. Senators came to their offices, they were royalty. So when he brought up the similar issues you and I brought up about stabilizing financial capitalism, which is ultimately what you and I want to do, stabilize the system from its own self-destructive tendencies. When Pope told his bosses and colleagues, he said he recalled that I was in a meeting with one of them and a few others, traders, and they were talking about the new hedge fund regulations. Most everyone on Wall Street thought they were a bad idea. But isn't it better for the system as a whole? I asked. The room went quiet, and my boss shot me a withering look. I remember his saying, I don't have the brain capacity to think about the system as a whole. All I'm concerned about is how this affects our company. So, from my perspective, this is my life experience. When I start to read these things, and I have limited interactions here and there in my life with such characters, as well as conservatives and Republicans who are very hardcore free market, even social Darwinist types, combined with the limited personal experiences I have in this deep dive in the research to really get to the core of these issues, that's what affected my thinking. And reading books authored by you and many other scholars out there who are a lot smarter than I am, who have a hell of a lot more life experience than I do. And I defer to people like that. And I trust people like you because of the evidence. Now, you obviously has a lot of life experience. You have your intellectual roots. So how did your life experience, similar to me with my research, with my more limited life experience exposure, how did your life experience shape your political views? Were you like me, who started out as a ragingly loyal Republican and Reagan guy? Or did you start as an independent because of what you saw in the world, your growing up experience and everything else?
I began as an independent. My family was not political. They were farmers raising cotton and cattle. Uh, when I went to undergraduate, I started off to be a civil engineer and wound up end of my junior year taking an elective course in economics, and it was revelatory. I just said, this is the profession I'm really interested in. And again, I worked for two governors in Oklahoma who were Republicans. They were the first Republicans, but they really weren't very partisan. I mean, both of them were Marines. One came from a large farming family, Henry Bellman. He was a Marine. He was fought all through the Pacific. The other was Dewey Bartlett, came from a very wealthy Wall family. He was a pilot in the Navy in World War II, fought in many of the battles as a fighter pilot. And he was very nonpartisan. The whole thing was, at that point, Oklahoma had been under one party rule since its founding in 1907 as a state. And it had become corrupt. And so they were dealing with corruption. And they both made a commitment to economic development of a state that was basically agricultural and oil. And so my career has not been a political one. I've been an independent. As such, I went with Ross Perot because he was dealing with something different. My life experiences, and I'm 83. My life experiences are such, and I've been a practicing economist for literally 60 years. Uh, my life experiences are such. TRW, well, my career with the three governors was interesting because I got to look at state and local dynamics, state and local politics, how it worked. All three of those governors were wonderful mentors to me. Uh, when I was with TRW, Dr. Mettler wound up being chairman. He became chairman of the Business Roundtable. And so I came to know a goodly portion of the top 100 CEOs, top university leaders inside the country from that position. And at that point, 40, 50 years ago, you fundamentally had corporations run by people who had come out of World War II, had fought in World War II, and had a sense of national purpose. You wound up with many of those people had grown up and were educated in the Midwest, and there they were really stakeholder guys. They basically said that their companies had a role in the country, and the stockholders were an important stakeholders. The workers were vital stakeholders. The workers and their families that made a living off. The country was a major stakeholder, and so it was a question of them balancing all of those industries. And on the whole, they were making no more than 20, 30% more than a worker on the line. Most of those companies were manufacturing companies or agricultural companies. The shift came, and personally, I have worked closely with several billionaires over the years. Roger Milliken of Milliken Company, the textile king is one. Obviously, Ross Perot, Jerome Lemelson, the great inventor, Sir James Goldsmith, who uh, was influential in Europe and was involved with him with the trade fights and a couple of others. And again, those billionaires were focused on more of a common good, a longer term view. It has been the financialization of the economy that has made the big shift. And the a landmark in that has been the work of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman did a piece in the New York Times in 1972, and he postulated the idea that the only responsibility of a CEO, the only stakeholder that a CEO should concern himself with, was the stockholders. And his job was the CEO's job was to maximize returns for the stockholders, no matter what else happened. And that it was the government's job to set the bounds on what those companies did. And basically, Wall Street just gobbled that up. They loved the idea. The other thing that was happening in that era, because of the unionization of the workforce, by the 70s, you had about a third of the workforce that was unionized. They had enormous pension funds, and so the unions were not prepared. They didn't have the skills to manage those funds productively. And so you wound up with Wall Street firms and venture capital firms managing those firms. And basically, they would get uh, something like 2% of the value of the funds to manage it. So if they're managing $1 billion pension funds, they get 20 million a year just as a fee to do it. And then they set it up where they would wind up getting a percentage of the gains, 20, 30%. Some of them went as high as 40 plus percent of the gains. So basically, what you wound up with is Wall Street looting union pension funds. And the principal of those firms to go into that business and really dominate it was Blackstone, which was Lawrence Fink. I think it was Fink who created the mortgage-backed instruments that led to the collapse of the economy in 2008, where you would package a bunch of junk bonds. You'd wind up with a rating agencies, give them a 3A rating. They would sell the whole package, and then you would wind up with mortgage companies, had easy credit, built houses that weren't needed, financed it with people who couldn't pay for it. And then the financial institutions that bought the bonds under the assumption that they were good instruments wound up having to pay for it. Well, that cost us something like $16 trillion. as a country. We had to bail out foreign banks that had bought our instruments. Uh, we wound up in the 80s and uh, in the 2008 forward, we wound up with the Federal Reserve bailing out most of our major institutions. Uh, Quite literally, we wound up, people just had their savings winded up because you could not use the banks for savings. I mean, literally, you were getting maybe 1%. In some places, you had to pay the banks to hold your money. It was because the Federal Reserve was loaning money, literally giving it its use to these banks to work themselves out. And not a single person went to prison. Not a single person was held accountable on that. So it's that shift to the financialization. And occurring at the same time, led by George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, we changed our trade laws. We changed our trade laws ostensibly to create and encourage free trade with the rest of the world. The rest of the world did not want free trade. They wanted the kinds of trade that they did. In some cases, it was state-owned industries, as in China. In other cases, it was state-backed industries, national champions, as in Germany and France and Japan. Other countries would just have a mix of that. But we insisted that the world adopt our style of trade. And so what we did over a number of years, we did trade negotiations to create a rules-based global trade system at a time when nobody else obeyed the rules. And the instrument that we focused on was cutting tariffs. This is thinking out of the 1920s and 1930s. So we wanted to cut tariffs. So other countries would engage in these furious and intense and complex negotiations, and they would increase tariffs. But at the same time, what they did, beginning in the mid 1950s in France, they shifted over to changing their tax system. Up until that time, most countries had used a direct tax system, as we have here, where you have a corporate tax, you pay on your profits, you have a personal tax, you pay on your income minus certain deductions, or you buy a good, you pay a sales tax. What these other countries shifted to as the keystone of their tax systems was value added tax.
Mm-hmm.
And the value added tax at each stage of production, the company pays an amount, whatever the rate is. In Europe, the average is 21%. So you pay 21% of the value added that you created. So if you're a farmer and you're producing cotton, and let's say, to keep it simple, you've got a 10% value added tax, and you sell the cotton for $10, you've created, since you're raising it from the seed, you've created $10 of value at a 10% VAT tax, you pay $1. Farmer sells it to the textile company to weave it into cloth. The textile company increases the value of it by 20%. They will then pay a $2. The textile maker sells it to a shirt maker. The shirt maker will add their value. Let's say it's 30%. So they pay $3 of tax. And then finally, it'll go to the retailer or the exporter or the manufacturer, and they'll increase their price, the retail margin profit, let's say $4, 40%. And so they'll pay $4 of that. The tax is hidden from the consumer. You never see the tax. It's built into the product. It's a production tax. Now, what other nations have done during these trade negotiations, they have created at the World Trade Organization, and before that through the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, they basically said, if we export this good, then we can rebate the $10 of total tax to the farmer, to the textile mill, to the shirt maker, to the retail outlet. We can rebate all of their taxes, and so they ship that to the United States, and so it comes into the United States. It's got a $10 subsidy because it's a product that comes in with no tax. At the same time, they changed the trade rules to say if a good comes in from a country that does not have a VAT, which means a direct tax, which we use, corporate, personal, sales tax. If it comes in, we can charge the entire value of the good that comes in the full 10%. So you're bringing a $50 shirt into that country, you add $5 on top the VAT. And then they, to add insult to injury, then you've got to pay a VAT on the VAT. So on the $5 VAT you pay, you got to pay 50 cents on that. And then on the shipping cost, you got to pay a VAT on that. And so what we've wound up with is a global trade system in which we cut tariffs, but at the same time that we were cutting tariffs, other countries were increasing their VAT. It's a de facto tariff. And so fundamentally, what we're winding up with, let's say in Europe, for example, is any product that's made in Europe comes to this country with a 21% state subsidy with a VAT rebate. Any American good that goes in to Europe is paying literally the 21%, plus they're paying another 2% the VAT on the VAT, and then they're paying shipping costs. So quite literally, any company that wants to sell to Europe, they must be 24% more efficient, more value added than the European product. Any manufacturer in the United States that's competing against a European good must be 21, 22% more competitive because the European good has the VAT rebate subsidy backing them up. At the same time, the U.S. company must pay its, any business must pay its corporate taxes, direct tax inside. So what you wind up with on our exports to Europe and 170 other countries is American exports are double taxed. They have to pay the American tax, and then they have to pay the European VAT tax on it. Hmm. And this has caused a major distortion. Since really the 60s, we've gone where we were running a surplus in goods trade with the rest of the world to the year 2022 and 2023. We ran a trade deficit of $1.1 trillion. We're going to run probably $1.2 trillion this year. And we've created every incentive for companies, American companies, that want to export, to go to countries such as Mexico and build and make your goods there and then ship it back in. And you get the rebate from the Mexican government. And those that are competing with you in the U.S. market are paying their corporate tax, and they're having to deal with this tax subsidy. And that is true around the world. It's true with China, it's true with Japan, Korea, all of our trading partners. What we have done is, by our pursuit of a rules-based economy, trying to get everyone to be like us, assuming that the principal trade obstacle was tariff, we've created a situation where we're deindustrializing as a country. And that's the reason we see our manufacturing and employment fall from about 18 million workers when NAFTA passed to about literally 12 million today. Or to put this into context, those raw numbers, that loss of a net of over 4 million jobs, is not really reflective of the damage. That's the best case story of the damage. Between over the past 30 years, our gross national product is seven times greater as such. And so we should have 25 or 30 million people in manufacturing. But no, since we bring all the goods that we use in from abroad, they're made by foreign workers, we're down to 12 million unemployment. And, that's very simple. Explained here in about 5 minutes, 6 minutes. You talk to members of Congress, they're really not interested in that.
Mhm.
They're really interested in cultural issues. They're really interested about trans issues. They're really interested in things like gay marriage. They're interested in things that don't really affect workers and people. And that is one of the reasons why the Democratic Party continues to lose elections. They have broken the bond with the American people. The Republicans, on the other hand, have been taken over by the finance industry and by a handful of high-tech billionaires and speculators as such. One of the exceptions, of course, is Elon Musk, who does produce products, but Musk is heavily dependent on subsidies. If you buy one of his cars, you get a $7,600 tax credit. SpaceX has been built with contracts from NASA and the Department of Defense. So what is happening is the American people are putting up a big part of the money for not only Musk, but for other people. And so you have public support and private gain off of this. This is something that's very difficult to explain. You wind up with most of the media aggressively do not wish to discuss this as such. You take a look at the major media like the Post, it's owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. Same is true with most of the social media as such. The other thing is most journalists do not understand these things, Nevin. And most economists have retreated in their profession into mathematics. Mathematics is so safe to deal rather than deal with political economy and what's happened. And so they wind up overwhelmingly spraying perfume. And it's Republican and Democrat. The term in Washington is called the Washington Consensus on an issue. Washington Consensus is basically both sides will agree on a policy, even if it's wrong. So you don't have the political dynamics that we require as a country.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to answer before we, move on to the next topic. I think you're spot on with a lot, and the research that I have and future essays as well as existing ones really confirms this. First of all, just as a side point, the newspaper article there was referring to on airline deregulation was authored by Hobart Rowan, and the title is America's Solo Flight. Washington Post, dated from March 24th, 1983, that quoted Barry Goldwater on his at least partial disillusionment with airline deregulation. Now, to answer your points, I think you're spot on once again.
Can I interrupt you?
Sure, go right ahead.
I began in the prologue of Saving Capitalism with a quote from Alan Greenspan that you alluded to earlier, is everything he believed in everything he espoused about financial markets collapsed when you had the Great Recession. Hang on, let me get a copy of that.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Well, I have Saving Capitalism here, so I can look it up.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Just reaching for a copy. I thought it was so revelatory. Here's what he wrote. Mr. Greenspan, I found a flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak. Chairman Waxman, in other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working. Mr. Greenspan, precisely. That's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I had been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well. The hearing done October the 23rd, 2008.
There you go. It's another penny in the jar.
Yeah, it's here was the architect of Ronald Reagan's plans. Mm-hmm. Here was the chairman of the Federal Reserve through the Clinton administration. And he admits, with the collapse that occurred in 2008, that his model and his view was wrong. Well, guess what? They patched that with glue and stapled that model back together, and that's still the model we're using.
Right. It was one of the signature many failures of the presidency of Barack Obama. And as you mentioned on the show, I was hoping that Barack Obama domestically would stabilize capitalism through a repudiation of Reaganomics and Clintonomics. I mean, he campaigned somewhat on that platform as a new FDR, and the prior policy priorities that he pursued was deeply disappointing to me at the time. I still had a lot of conservative beliefs, but by 2008, that's when I started to read, to the audience here, Pat's books. That's when I started to read, and Dangerous Business was actually, if I recall correctly, the first one I read, and I'm like, oh my God. So I started to read that book as well as many others, and it really continued my path or accelerated my path to a hard rethinking. And Barack Obama failed miserably in his presidency in many ways. And I voted for him in 2008. And that's when, I started to continue to revise my views, which I really started to revise my views mid-1990s. It's a long story. Maybe we can go over it at a different time. Now, your mention regarding trade is spot on. I compare America's trade history, and many like you and Mr. Eccles, I believe, who wrote a book on the two-part.
Right, L.A. Keys.
Yeah, he was on the ITC, the International Trade Commission, was one of the commissioners. I mean, many people have written histories about this. You and I are not unique in that way. And I look at it as this snowball effect that started after World War II, when we started to liberalize our trade laws. I think it was in 1952, Japan and the United States signed a trade agreement. You had the reciprocal trade agreements, the Trade Expansion Acts of President Kennedy, and there were plenty of dissenting voices in the Senate, the House, and even within the administrations and the intelligence community on the real dangers of that. And the protectionists in both parties, particularly at the time at the Republican Party, were absolutely correct in their predictions of the results of what would happen with this sort of exporting our industries overseas. And I look at it, it was geopolitics. It was three things, really. It was geopolitics, ideology, and special interests, particularly on Wall Street, that you pointed out, that really favored this type of treaty. And as historians have written about the banking industry, there was this understanding that there was a short memory span from the Depression. As the old school bankers who were more conservative died out, The younger bankers starting in the 1970s started to say, look, our system is stable. Same voices that said in the Truman administration, by the way, including Truman himself, that our industries, like our banks, our banks are indestructible. We can outcompete anybody. Not a problem. We don't need Glass-Steagall. We learned our lesson. That's what they would say publicly. And of course, it was a snowball effect. And different people said, there's some real good quotes here by the British scholars Gerard and Victoria Curzon, who noted in 1976, I was 2 or 3 years old at that time. And even then they were saying that. Post-war trade liberalization has been a beneficial exercise for America's trade partners. And if any country could be said to have lost within our given time horizon, it was the United States itself. Thierry de Montbrial, I speak some Spanish, not French, so forgive me for butchering the pronunciation. He was an economist from the École Polytechnique, the Polytechnic School in Paris, remarked in January 1977, free trade is, of course, a myth, an Anglo-Saxon myth in particular. It exists less and less. The GATT rules are no longer followed. However, in our mentality, we stick to the idea of free trade as an ideal to be achieved and think that we owe our prosperity in the last 20 years to this ideal. So it's kind of like I don't want to sound disrespectful, but the priest or the rabbi basically saying we love God, but in reality, they do ungodly things behind the scenes when nobody is looking. That's essentially, it's called lip service here. And really, that's been the history. And I think the discussion and the points you brought up about the VAT is very critical. I mean, even under the first Trump administration, there was, I remember, some movement in Congress and some pressure to add on a VAT that even I was shocked to find this out, but even former Speaker Paul Ryan even was supportive of. But that never got anywhere, and we can talk about the how and the why about that as a side question that you can respond to. So you had that. You have also a lot of other non-tariff barriers. I mean, the Chalmers Johnson has talked about it in his books on Japan and MITI. You have an extreme amount of statism that far went beyond what America did. You have low interest loans, grants, all kinds of a panoply of subsidies, nationalized or politicized central banks. You have a number of state-owned enterprises. You have also a culture that is more collectivistic about nations basically sticking together to support their own. You also have, in the case of totalitarian trade partners like the old Soviet Union, which, by the way, we imported slave labor goods from the Soviet Union. According to a statistic, I think it was $138 million worth in the 1980s, which, by the way, the Reagan administration killed efforts to cease importation of Gulag Soviet goods. By the way, conservatives and Reagan lovers, did you know that? No, but that's history. I don't like it, but it's reality. So, and also not to mention the Laogai goods from China, which the West has, not including the United States, but the West has been importing since at least the 1970s. So you have that too as well. You have all these non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation. The conservative labor union columnist Victor Riesel wrote in Human Events a very excellent expose of how the Chinese used currency manipulation, even in the early 1980s, to initially gain and dump textiles into the United States, which the Reagan administration didn't really do much. And even Carter was kind of guilty. Yes, they've had the multi-fiber agreements and whatnot, which kind of was a Band-Aid or a stapling on a festering sore that was already getting out of control, in my opinion.
Can I speak to that on the multi-fiber agreement?
Sure, go right ahead. Yeah, feel free.
For the audience, the multi-fiber agreement is the United States set up an agreement by which it would allow countries to import into this country a certain volume and dollar value of textiles. This is the major market for textiles. And other countries use slave labor and penny wage labor to produce their textiles. And in many countries, the industries are state owned, as in China. And so, what we have done over the years, what we did over the years, is as part of political negotiations, we would say that you can import $200 million of textiles into the United States over time. We got into the GATT negotiations and then in the creation of the World Trade Organization by George H.W. Bush and by Bill Clinton in the period really from 91 through 94. And so we wanted votes at the World Trade Organization. And so we promised other countries to dramatically increase the amount of textiles that they could bring in to this country. When the deal was finally made, basically what happened originally is the Chinese worked with other countries. We effectively eliminated the multi-fiber agreement. It was part of the negotiations that said, okay, you vote for this, and we will do away with the multi-fiber agreement. What we in effect said, we're willing to give up this industry if you will vote for the World Trade Organization. And we did, and they did. And so we basically lost America's apparel and textile industry. We had literally throughout the South textile factories. We had it in LA, we had it in New York. We had textile manufacturing companies. Every major textile company in that era subsequently went to other stuff, gone out of business. The apparel industry is now basically in China because nobody could produce against China because the government was financing China. We gave that industry away. We destroyed hundreds of towns where those were the only factories. We did exactly the same thing in the machine tool industries. We did the same thing. We did that with Japan by Reagan. We did the same thing with electronics as such. We did that. Nixon did that, and Jimmy Carter sealed the fate of those industries. We literally can run through a series of industries where we've given away the industry for foreign policy reasons. Nixon did it to get Japan's support in the Vietnamese War. Jimmy Carter did it because he was in the middle of the Tokyo round of negotiations. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton did it because they wanted to create the World Trade Organization. And most Americans and most politicians know nothing of that history of how it works behind the scene. And in fact, what we had is Congress with with Ronald Reagan, with George H.W. Bush, and with Bill Clinton. They gave them the right to negotiate the agreements with no oversight of Congress. Congress did not have the right to look at the agreement until it was presented in the form of legislation. In other words, basically, we turned over negotiations of our trade relationships, our industry, and the global economy. Congress turned that over to those presidents, and those presidents, in effect, use them as chips in the foreign policy business.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And I want to address that. And let's not underestimate, from my research, as you saw personally, the part played by the apparel import lobby, the retail lobby, both not only for apparel, but also consumer electronics. And that just murdered our industries. And the other thing is that when I look at international relations with so-called allies, I don't like to use the term allies unless I'm trying to convey a point. I like to term it that nations have intersections of interest.
Right.
Let's take Japan and West Germany during the Cold War, major trade partners of ours. We had an invested interest, obviously, to prevent those countries from becoming communists through Soviet Union, China, etc., or East Germany too, since it was right across the border from West Germany. But what many people don't realize, especially what you learn in your high school, even undergraduate school, correct me if I'm wrong here in the audience, you don't learn about the interzonal trade between West Germany and East Germany, which became, I want to say legal basically with the swing credits, which basically was a revolving credit line with West Germany, its banks, that East Germany had access to. And
Right.
what that effectively did was subsidize East Germany up until the collapse, I argue, a controlled collapse of the GDR in 1990. And there was also a lot of trade in strategic goods. You had machine tools from West Germany going to East Germany. Our CIA knew it. I quoted in my book, Turning the Page, as well as also my upcoming Myths of the Day, which I have notes here. You also have our allies not only being allies. Japan violated, just like West Germany, COCOM agreements, the different companies. Japan was North Korea's largest non-communist trading partner during the Cold War. That you can get in the country studies series. Remember those white hard-covered books that used to be the Army handbook, area handbook series, country area handbook series? They were green hardcover. Yeah, I'm a library geek, so that's my profession.
Right.
Many of you know I like to hit the books. Best education you can get. But even our allies sometimes gave us a hard time if they didn't agree with us on certain conflicts. For example, in testimony before Senate, Admiral Thomas Moore reported that during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where I was heavily involved, not one NATO nation would let us land an airplane in Europe if it was going to Israel. Just recently, with the Libyan operation against Muammar Gaddafi, neither Spain nor France would let us overfly their country. And there are at least a dozen of these other stories that I document, including in my recent piece, If Goods Doesn't Cross Borders, Army Will, which is basically a repudiation of Bastier's view that if we allow goods to cross borders, the nations will become friends. Jean-Baptiste Say, the father of Say's law that we all have studied, myself included, in the Econ 101 and 102 classes. And I just look at these statements and it's just so, at best, so naive, head in the clouds, with all due respect, or just words patently dishonest. Japan is a very nationalistic country. I don't begrudge them that. I don't particularly have any dislike towards Japan or its government, but there was elements of a revanchist nationalism within the people, and I guess I could understand that to agree when you're a conquered and defeated country from the other point of view, but I'm just stating this as fact. We have to state the facts in order to analyze a policy. For example, you had Joseph J. Sullivan, a former employee of Sony, was informed by the Japanese industrialist Akio Morita, very well known, big celebrity back in the day. He said, militarily, we could never defeat the United States, but economically, we can overcome the United States and become the number one in the world. You had also Morita and Shintaro Ishihara, the Minister of Transport and leading Liberal Democratic Party member. Liberal Democratic Party, Japan was largely a two-party system, still is. You have the Social Democrats, and then you have the Liberal Democratic Party, which is, quote, more conservative. They threaten in their book, Japan Says No, that Japan could provide high technology secrets to the Soviet Union, which they did already, as a bargaining tool against the US and refused to sell components that go into American missiles. So again, when I look at this, I compare what Jean-Baptiste Say, Milton Friedman, Frederick Abastier, and others, and then you read the facts here that I have unveiled and the facts that you've unveiled. It's just this free trade liberalism and laissez-faire liberalism doesn't really make sense. It's a good starting point. But when you read this, as a historian, I'm like scratching my head and saying, well, wait a minute. I call BS on this, basically. And it's like, and you're right about the both parties not caring too as well. I think that's a very important point. But look, as many members, many in the audience know, I'm a staunch opponent of communism. One of the things I don't like is the deception and the dishonesty and the divide and rule and divide and conquer strategy that even the various communist groups, Democratic Socialists of America, they will use to gain influence. Well, let me tell you, the establishments in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do the same thing too as well. Now, as a former Republican, and I like conservative goals very much, but there is to me personally, it's kind of sinister. It's not honest. I don't like it. It rubs me the wrong way. But you have conservatives playing this and admitting this too as well, that it's a deliberate plan to advance their economic agenda by using culture war issues. Paul Weyrich, ironically, because he repudiated aspects of laissez-faire economics. He was a big, as you remember, supporter over time towards the end of his life about the impositions of tariffs, as well as also he's a big proponent at the end of his life of public transportation and trains. So it's kind of ironic he said this back in 1982 at the CPAC conference. He said, let me tell you frankly, there are those rural people in West Virginia who don't understand Reaganomics and who frankly are being hurt by Reaganomics and who frankly wouldn't like it if they did understand it. That statement says a lot of things if you read between the lines. If those people aren't hearing the issue of prayer in the schools in that West Virginia Senate race, then Bobby Byrd, or Robert Byrd, but senator at the time, is going to be back in the United States Senate and in Tennessee. If they're not hearing those issues, then Senator Sasser is going back in the Senate. And he said, Paul Weyrich said again in the 1980s, we can't win by defending Reaganomics. We can only win by pushing those populist, conservative, anti-elitist themes which real people support. I'm not going to try to explain trickle down to an unemployed steel worker in Birmingham. But that same steel worker, if asked to choose between our desire to see hardened criminals punished and the liberals' defense of the soft-headed judges, will be with us. That's where it's at. And before I ask my next question, you can certainly comment on all the points that I've made. I'm going to be frank with you. For the Democrats to win, they're going to have to swallow some hard medicine, and they're going to have a big tent on social issues. They're going to have to be autistically obsessed with economic so-called populism or reinventing capitalism, and then just really just cede to the different districts, states, counties, the social issues. So down in my area, Florida, Orlando, or Miami, certain Democrats can run on pro-LGBTQ platform. Personally, I support being fair to everybody as long as they're people of good faith and good American citizens. But in rural parts of Florida, they're going to have to run on a more conservative social agenda in order to then focus in on how so-called trickle-down economics or Reaganomics or whatever you want to call it has really failed you. Look at your material conditions. And I think there's going to have to be an education program where things have to be explained in simplistic terms. You and I are academically oriented, and yes, we're in our own ways straight talkers, but you need somebody to boil this down and say, this is what's happened. We believe in the American dream. We do not believe in socialism and want to create Cuba. No, we don't love Venezuela. And we don't want to tax the rich out of existence. But here, what I'm trying to do on this show is to educate people and unwrap the history. That's why I'm reading these quotes. You don't hear this on talk radio on either side. You don't hear this. So that's, I think you bring up a lot of good points. And there are a dozen other quotes I could read and bore you and bore the audience that basically says the same thing. And the Democrats do the same strategy too as well. And that started, and you can obviously comment and then I'll ask my next question. The Democrats did that starting in the 1970s, and Thomas Frank, the progressive historian, has pointed this out, where the Atari Democrats, as they used to be called, then they became the DLC and New Democrats, which they pushed out the George Meany AFL-CIO type of Democrats that were either centrist or very right-wing on social issues, but economically they were, by our standards, centrist, meaning avoiding laissez-faire capitalism and financialization, but also avoiding actual socialism, communism, and the fascism on the big government side. Those forces got pushed out because they supported the American position during the Vietnam War. They were viewed as reactionaries, and that opened up the door to a coalition in the Democrats of the New Left, progressives, on the one side, that used to be the New Left, and then on the other hand, the corporate Democrats. Judith Stein, who is a historian who is now deceased, wrote in a book called Pivotal Decade. She pointed out that by the 1984 election, I'm reading the speaking extemporaneously now, she wrote that in the 1984 elections, that actually corporate money was at the same level, if not exceeded, AFL-CIO money from its political action. So right. That's kind of my responses to you. I think again you're spot on. Before I ask my question, is there anything you'd like to add, or do you disagree with what I say? What are your thoughts about the information I brought up here?
I agree with it. I agree with it. I knew Paul Weyrich, did several things with him over the years, and you characterized his positions very well. If you sit and think of our two political parties, what has been the conditions in which the Democrats won? It's really a crisis situation. Basically, Democrats have succeeded if they have a candidate who holds a position in either the governorship or the Senate. They're legitimatized because they've been through the electoral process as such, one or two or three or more times. They are not known. They're not defined. And then as you move in to the end of the primary system, when they win, April, May, sometime in that period, leading to the election, they can define themselves. They have a chance to be whatever they want to portray themselves as. That was true with Jimmy Carter coming off of the Watergate scandal. It was true with Bill Clinton. I mean, here was Carter. Well, let's just start with Carter. Here he was a governor, Democratic governor, legitimate position. And then he runs in the race. He beats establishment candidates. The core of his campaign is "I will never lie to you." And basically, he was defined at the last minute. Gerald Ford was, closely linked with Nixon. He had done the pardon. Carter wins. Bill Clinton, small state governor, legitimate, been around, networked, really was part of the Democratic establishment as such, had been involved in creating Democratic leadership. uh, COVID-19. We had hundreds of thousands of people dying. And so what we wind up there is, and I think what it's probably going to require uh, is a Democrat who can speak to the general population. They're going to need someone that has issues that are understandable. Uh, they should not be running for the university crowd intellectual. They should be running on some very straightforward things, certain things that they're far, that they can articulate, that they can get it down almost to an epigram.
Mhm.
Uh, and if they do that, uh, then they can do it. If they run on these broad issues, they can't do it. The Republicans will follow the wire trade book, campaign book. They will boil it down to a few cultural issues. It'll be about school boards. It'll be about in 84 and 80 in 2004. It boiled down to gay rights. Trans issues were a big part of this election. Simplified message, etc. Create a social outrage. Have people vote on that and forget the rest of it. That's what they are. So the Democrats have got to figure out how to message issues. They cannot deal with the kind of esoteric stuff that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. There was a period for about a minute or two at most where we had some technical difficulty and the computer froze, so people were not able to hear you. You left off regarding the 1970s with the Ford administration and the transformation of the Democrats. So I just wanted you just to kind of recap that because I think our audience might have missed it. I didn't even hear it either.
Oh,
So,
basically, the Democrats in recent years have won with a candidate that is in a legitimate elected position, but are not known as individuals. Jimmy Carter was not known when he ran for president. He really didn't become known until he got into the latter days of the campaign against Mo Udall and a couple of others.
mhm.
And then he was able to define himself in that few months before the election, and he defined himself that I will never lie to you against all the lies that Nixon had told. He really ran against Nixon. And the same thing with Bill Clinton, small state governor, was well known inside the Democratic Party establishment because he had curated them. And but again, he ran against Bush, who was in a high inflationary period there. Same thing with Barack Obama, unknown senator, had been in the Senate 4 years, literally almost went to deal to run the moment he hit the Senate floor. And so that is what the Democrats do. The big problem is the Democrats can't message, and they're stuck in this Washington consensus on foreign policy and economics. I wrote Saving Capitalism. I wrote that in, I don't know, 5 months, 6 months. Uh, the dangerous business I had worked on for, I don't know, 3 years, and it happened to come out just as the economy was collapsing in 2008. And so I wrote Saving Capitalism as solutions that could be used. I went with Marcy Kaptur and spent a good deal of time in the White House trying to sell those solutions. I couldn't sell them. Larry Summers and Obama, Larry Summers, who was the economic advisor to Obama, had been Treasury Secretary for Clinton.
Yes.
Their whole focus was in saving the banks
Yep.
and saving them in a way that you didn't change any leadership. Not a single leader in the banks changed. Massive crimes, not a single person was held accountable for those crimes. And They even they went short on the solutions. They could have brought us out of that with heavier, faster solutions. And so they went with the Washington consensus. So, you know, my perspective on this is we've got to have a Democratic leader that will be of the nature of Teddy Roosevelt, whose picture you have there. I'm a great admirer of his, or Franklin Roosevelt, who will literally is really not that concerned about offending the powers that be. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt just trumped all over J.P. Morgan on his antitrust and to break that up. FDR did the same thing with Wall Street and the power elite of our country at that time to break it up. So that's what it's going to require. The other thing I would note on this, I think you've got to disassociate the personalities in the party. I do. Donald Trump is a powerful personality, has a fierce loyalty by his voters. That will not transfer to J.D. Vance or Ted Cruz or anyone else. The Republican Party is really going to have to think what they stand for and what they're going to do after Trump leaves the scene. He's going to control it as long as he's on the scene, but once he leaves, that's going to be interesting. The other point that I would make in this is there are windows of opportunity to make policy change. It happened with Teddy Roosevelt. It happened with Franklin Roosevelt. It happened with Reagan when he came in. We're getting ready. We're entering a new era right now. It's the Trump era. And don't know how long it will last. But there's an opportunity here to shake things up, to do things differently. And I think people just, whatever their hatred is of Trump, they've got to just put that aside and just look at the situation. Where are we? What are the options? There are certain options that have not been on the table that Trump makes available. There are certain options that were on the table that are off the table now, that Trump's here. So from a public policy perspective, our challenge is to identify the options that are possible and then to frame it and see how we can make it happen.
Yeah, I think those are all good points that you make. Again, it's very practical points. I think, again, we have to focus on the economics and national security issues.
Right.
I think we also have to show that we like a lot of conservative ideals, that most people across genders, races, sexual orientations, whatnot, and that it doesn't have to be necessarily divisive. It could be a sort of big tent, if you will, that accepts people from all walks of life. And I agree, it has to be simplified into a very marketable message. Number two, there is also going to be huge fights within the local party executive committees, and I know it exists, but there's going to be some real fights, and I think we have to just, in the Democratic side or the Republican side, they need to be sustained. Thirdly, I think people need to start to get organized. If you like, I'm a member of my labor union of the OPIEU. I'm starting to get more involved with them. I filled out a survey. We had a meeting last night. I'm a member of my union. I want to become involved. I think people need to do that. One thing I found out from last night's meeting, and this group has over 2,800 members total, and the Florida state government under the Republican majority and Ron DeSantis, for the most part, they're looking in good Grover Norquist style to wreck it, essentially, by passing a variety of laws and rules that ultimately are designed to break the union movement in places like Florida. And what they admitted to me is that quite a few of their members are Republicans. So I think there needs to be an education effort, and it needs to be done very delicately with working class Republicans. So there's going to be a lot of pushback. I know the Young Turks, which is a program on YouTube, on TV or YouTube, by Cenk Uygur. He is appearing on these various conservative and libertarian networks for whatever his reasons. I think that's a good idea. I also think they need to tamp down the anti-war message, this sort of Noam Chomsky, Tom Hayden message, because that I'm going to be honest with you, that's why I never joined the left, because what happens is they denigrate America, rightly or wrongly, but they give a pass, or they just don't mention the crimes and intentions of a country like North Vietnam or Cuba, or in today's cases, in some ways, Russia, China, Venezuela, etc. And they need to tack a path, and I say this also not only Democrats but Republicans, where we say, look, we're for a strong national defense, and it's criminal that we don't have things like civil defense, anti-EMP to harden our grid, and things of that nature, anti-missile defense. But on the other hand, and that Russia and China really continue to pose a threat. But at the same time, let's take a hard look and ask questions like, in 2023, defense contractors, instead of spending the bulk of their profits on R&D, they're spending more of their profits on stock buybacks. And that also, and they also overcharge the government. I mean, you have many studies. You have people like Shay Assad, who used to be one of the Pentagon negotiators, who was fired under the first Trump administration. You know, Mr. Drain the Swamp, Donald Trump, well, fired somebody who really pushed to drain the swamp the best he can when it came to defense procurement. So we have to take an honest look and say, look, we're not like, okay, let's totally be non-interventionist, that America is the sole evil in the world and we provoke these countries in all manner of ways. But at the same time, we have to take also a hard look at our interventionism as well on the flip side, and also take a look at our military spending. Where is all this federal money truly going? Is it going into just stock buybacks, overcharging, and the revolving door between generals and Pentagon officials and defense contractors and whatnot? Is it looking? I mean, there was one report where we spent in Afghanistan and Iraq $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Pat, think about how many programs, defense, productive public sector, social programs, that it could have gone to. I mean, that is just staggering. So this is, go ahead.
What if we had to put that into electric generation? What if we had created a high-speed rail system inside this country? What if we beefed up, our wastewater? I mean, it's a tragedy.
It really is. And this has to start with education. And what I say to the audience, there has to be also several things. One of the reasons why I started this program is I wanted to get myself in the fray. At my workplace, we had police officers who were veterans, and they said, Nevin, you have all this knowledge, all this reading. It's a crime you're not sharing it. And they were the motivators that really pushed me to do this. And some of whom were ex-military. People like John Berena, ex-Special Forces, was worked for one of our local police agencies, veteran murder homicide detective, and other people. He served in the Middle East and Central America. And they say that, Nevin, you're so common sense, you make so sense, and you do the research. And I said to myself, you know what? I have to get involved. I have to do the writing and make an effort. And I say this there are a lot of bright people my age and younger or older out there. Get involved. There's free software out there that you can use to record I can't tell you how many times I've pushed myself. I've written emails to multiple people to try and get on the program, to network and everything. This is important. What I say, and some people who agree with us, they're not always responsive. Either they're busy, they may take a, this is just theory, they may take a look at my material, they might not like it or agree with certain parts. I do make, as you read, controversial positions, but they are well reasoned, they
Yeah.
are well researched. It's not like I'm shooting from the hip and speaking hyperbolically in hyperbole, but we have to network with each other and create ultimately a coalition where we all are successful together. Yes, we can make money. Part of this, I do want to kind of make a side living, but I want to do it doing the right thing by the American people. That's one thing I'm very adamant about and unbending about. And we have to stick together and develop coalitions with different groups, unions, businesses, individuals to advance our agenda. And it's going to be very difficult because we don't have the resources like the opposition does. But we need to start networking in our local Republican clubs, our Democratic clubs, develop an online presence because education is critical. I have not watched mainstream news other than local news since 2008. I have not watched CNN on a regular basis since Lou Dobbs was basically pushed out since 2008. Occasionally, I would watch MSNBC when Crystal Ball and Ed Schultz was there. When they were basically pushed out or fired, I ceased watching MSNBC. Fox News, by the time I got into Fox News, it was just their line of thinking was so repugnant to me. I just could never stomach listening to extreme forms of social Darwinism and callousness. It just, for many different reasons, it just was abhorrent to me. So now I get my news from a lot of research, print and electronic sources, social media, meaning links to articles, and YouTube channels that are credible, in my view, with credible personalities like you or Michael Lind or Julius Krein of American Affairs or Oren Cass. And, you know, I know you want to get back into the fray, if you will, into the conversation. The good news is there are forces on the right that are shifting the conversation slowly. You have people like Oren Cass and his people of American Compass. You have Saurabh Amori of Compact Magazine, and now he's moved on to a different publication, but is still staying active. You have people in American Affairs, which is a disparate collection of conservatives as well as sort of dissident liberals or leftists. So you have me, you have differing people with varying degrees of influence out there. And Cass is presenting a threat because the crew at Americans for Trade Reform and Americans for Tax Reform, including Grover Norquist himself, as well as you have a whole bunch of them, American Enterprise Institute, they have been threatened. They feel threatened by Cass because they're giving American Compass quite a bit of attention and basically insulting him, basically, or engaging in somewhat good faith debate with him. There's definitely some movement, but it's going to be slow. The Republicans, I think you're right. There is going to be a fight in the Republican Party because you have what I term zombie Reaganomics that is still very powerful. That's the thing. Reagan was very charismatic, but do a lot of people know that he presided over a continued economic downturn for the majority of people in this country? They don't. They're just mystified by his charisma and his personality and his seeming, patriotic veneer, mom and apple pie, morning in America. And that is aggressively promoted by Conservatism Incorporated, if you will. And they're very powerful. They have a lot of money behind them. So it's going to be an uphill battle, but I think all of us have to do our part. And I think a lot of it comes through local involvement as well as a lot of education amongst the citizens, like what we're doing right now. So, now since we talked about the Democrats, and I think you laid out a good strategy for them, what about the Republicans? What would you counsel the Republicans? Because I am very afraid that they're going to go on full scale austerity, not even because of the actual national debt, but because they do not believe in the New Deal. And I think that's what their agenda is all along. They don't believe in the New Deal. They don't agree really with the American system of economics. To explain to the audience who's not familiar, there's basically three pillars: tariffs to protect and develop American industry, infrastructure, known back at the time of the American system as internal improvements, as well as also developing a national bank, not the Federal Reserve per se, but an actual nationalized central bank that would be involved in credit disbursement. That's the American system. People like Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, and others, they absolutely hate the New Deal. They do not believe in the positive aspects of the progressive era. They hate unions, and they do not like the American system of political economy to a large degree. So, what would you counsel Republicans?
Two other pillars to that.
Sure.
One pillar that is essential is enforceable contract. Quite literally, to engage in business, you must be assured that if the contract is violated, you have private means, and that means the courts, to enforce the contract. That's essential to capitalism. The second basic pillar is intellectual property rights. One of the foundations of our system was the fourth act that the first Congress enacted at the request of George Washington, and that was to create a patent and a copyright system. You've got to allow creative people who think of something new that will benefit the nation to have exclusive use of that invention for a set period of time, and then be in exchange for that sort of what I call a golden covenant to share that knowledge with the rest of society. That's what's called the progressive clause in the Constitution. So I think those two other things are an absolute foundation in our society. And Obama administration undercut that. And also the Clinton started it, but Obama affected it. It quite literally he strongly weakened our patent system. In the past, the patent went to the first person to invent. Now it's to the first person to file. In the past, a patent issuance of a patent was considered proof of ownership. Now, Obama set up an administrative structure, administrative law, where judges appointed by the patent office, not confirmed by the Senate, will take a look at a patent if it's challenged and have the authority to negate it. We've also essentially cut away the rights of inventors to go to federal court and have it tried before a judge or a jury as to the validity of patents. So those are things that I think are essential and that have been weakened and need to be re-strengthened.
Yeah, what do you predict and what do you see going on in the Trump administration that's incoming, of course, in January of 2025? Because I see also certain split elements too as well. You have the so-called new right of the Warren Cass, J.D. Vance, Sohrab Ahmari type people who are not necessarily hostile to the new Deal and certainly supportive of the American system. I see Trump as someone who is prone to massaging his ego. That's the way to get to them. And the people in Conservatism Incorporated basically got to him in his first term through that. And my biggest fear is that he's going to double down on intense amount of austerity, that a lot of the people that would be on my side or your side would be marginalized, or their voices would not be as significant, and that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and the Heritage Foundation are going to really go full force with their so-called reforms and really turn this country back to the Gilded Age. I mean, Grover Norquist, who of Americans for Tax Reform, he flat out admitted that he basically wants the return to the McKinley era minus the tariffs. And my fear is that we're going to return to that country. And not only is that economically undesirable and breeds instability, but it also is a national security issue because it's in an antagonize many people, even more people, including especially our youngest people, my daughter's generation, against capitalism. And they're going to equate all forms of capitalism with just greed, and that they're going to be, I mean, look at what Tucker Carlson did in Moscow, for example. He showed Russia, rightfully or wrongfully, as a society on the move, new subways, allegedly cheaper price in their private and state supermarkets and everything, a shining city, and many other people, Americans have done that. And they're going to latch on to alienated Americans. And we saw this during the Depression. I found this fun fact. In about 1931, Amtorg, which was the Soviet American Trading Corporation based in New York, they took in applications of 100,000 Americans who wanted to emigrate to the Soviet Union. Why? Because the American system was failing, and our response was very poor and non-existent before FDR. And people were looking to fascist Italy or National Socialist Germany or Japan or the Soviet Union as models. And my fear is that that's going to occur if Trump and Vance and really Vivek and Elon are going to press. And really the congressional Republicans are generally, even if they make noises against China, there really has been no real decoupling from China. I know Biden and Trump have made some moves in the right direction, but they really have not gone full force. And there really needs to be, the problem is that our government really doesn't believe in governing. It's paralyzed by a drown the government in the bathtub at all costs ideology. And there are people that profit from that. Really, to decouple from Russia, which we have to a degree, but not from other countries, including China, it's going to require a Manhattan Project level commitment by our government. It's what Elizabeth Warren and others would term the whole of government strategy. And that's what's needed, because the other side, China and Russia, they have a whole of government strategy. And while they have severe problems within their countries, I would counsel my fellow American patriots that we have to also have some humility as well, because we have a lot of deep problems. To bring it up to date, our supply chains are so broken, especially for our defense industries, that we cannot produce enough artillery shells to resupply Ukraine. That is a fact. We have issues also with, if Taiwan got into a war with communist China, God forbid, that we do not have enough missiles capability to produce missiles in a timely fashion to resupply or aid the Taiwanese. And these are admitted by generals. This is not me saying this. This is not Pat Choate saying this. I'm not pulling this out of my rear end. This is facts. These are concerns. And do you know how long, I say this to the audience, this has been going on, where generals have warned about this since the 1980s? You probably remember General Wickham, who was top-level general during the Reagan administration, warned in 1987 that we could not last in a war against the Soviet Union for more than a couple of months, because we just, even then, our defense industrial base was severely compromised. We've outsourced so much of our production, even under Reagan and, of course, his predecessors. That's how bad and how long it is. You had the director of FEMA under Reagan in 1983, and even Caspar Weinberger, the former defense secretary under Reagan, well, part of Reagan's administration. that warned against this too as well. This is not Nevin Gussack saying this, oh, me being paranoid or being some state socialist or collectivist. No, this is reality. These are what the professionals are saying. People that are a lot smarter than me. Go ahead.
I would join that. I was vice chairman on the Defense Science Board, did a report for the Pentagon in 1990, and on the defense industrial base and foreign ownership. Let me get rid of this phone here. And that report is classified, but part of it was published in the New York Times. And basically, it confirms everything you're saying, but much worse. And then I did a report for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission in 2005, which is available on the internet. It's called Advanced Technology Trade, U.S. Advanced Technology Trade. And so I went through all of the advanced technologies and our dependence on foreign sources. And it is astounding. At the point I wrote that, we had a $40 billion deficit. That's now, I took a look at it last year, it's up to about $200 billion. And these are the key items. We can't build stealth airplanes without bringing in parts. We can't build submarines without building the parts. We can't build our fighter planes. We cannot build our drone systems without doing that. The one thing I hope that Elon Musk and Vivek are able to do is shake up procurement inside the Defense Department. I find it just absolutely astounding that we only set aside $100 million for research and development on drones. If there's one thing that the Ukraine war has taught us, is that much of our battlefield equipment at this point, battlefield tactics, are obsolete. Russia has lost almost 5,000 of its combat vehicles to drones as such. The Bradley tanks that we've given them are vulnerable to drones. Fundamentally, rather than purchasing antiquated weapons, we need new weapon systems, new thinking there. It's very much, as was the case in World War II, as we prepared for World War II, we were building battleships. The one thing that the Battle of Midway taught us is that carriers were the essential weapons. And it's the same way now. So much of our thinking, so much of our equipment is for wars of the past. They're about as effective as the Maginot Line was in protecting the French. And hopefully Musk and them can do it. I've read studies about SpaceX, and he's in competition with Lockheed and Boeing on the space vehicles. He's building those vehicles. He's building his space systems at a fraction of the cost of what those contractors are. That sort of thinking innovation is going to be essential. We really need to rethink our war strategies and the way the equipment that we buy.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't like you what I'm detecting. I also don't dismiss all the concepts of the quote unquote Department of Government Efficiency. I'm a believer in more of the what has been termed good government and clean and efficient government. There's a tremendous amount of waste across the spectrum, and both conservatives as well as people more on the liberal left, depending on the issues or the departments or the sectors of the government, have written a number of good studies on that. And I think there definitely is a place for that, because tax money that is, quote, wasted or overspent can be reinvested into other programs that are very much needed. Take defense, like hardening our grid, for example, which I talk about in my Substack essay, was a sensible defense policy. There's one thing that I also wanted to read too. Go ahead.
Can I say on that, just to interject, so I
Sure, sure.
this point. Uh, Most people do not understand the electromagnetic pulse and the danger that it creates to this country. Is just a quick example. North Korea, China, Russia, as one of their options, have the one bomb strategy. Basically, it is you crack a nuclear weapon at around 200 miles above the U.S. And within the radius of that, you send out an electronic pulse that destroys all semiconductors as such. Fundamentally, is what it means is our economy would go back to the 18th century in a millionth of a second. Quite like cell phones wouldn't work, cars wouldn't work, trucks wouldn't work, trains wouldn't work. Your local water system couldn't pump, your sewage system wouldn't work. You'd have no electricity in your homes. That's what a electromagnetic pulse is. Now, what is positive about this is that Trump, in 2017, in the first year of his first administration, signed an executive order ordering that effective remedies be developed. I don't know to what extent they've succeeded, but I see no visible evidence. I know our military is all over it. We have all kinds of EMP weapons that we could apply to another country. But as you're saying, we haven't hardened our grid system as such, which is the most fundamental thing that we need to do in this country. We still have a grid system that's an artifact of the 19th century, and it's totally vulnerable to an EMP attack. That's why it's so dangerous that North Korea has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S. They could pop 3 nuclear weapons, East Coast, West Coast, and central part of the U.S., and take out all of our electronics.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And don't forget the Russians. I mean, look, the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans, they all have their weaknesses, but they also have strengths that also need to be examined. And I think there's a tendency of self-soothing amongst American academics and policy elites. They want to soothe themselves and say, oh, we're okay. And they'll point to an example like, for example, a North Korean military defector going across the DMZ in a Jeep, and then he was found as infected with parasitic infections. You have, I think there were stories in the news allegedly about China, its subs like sinking or rusting Russian naval vessels in the 1990s. And what I'm going to say is really controversial, and this idea was purged out of the CIA, if you will, as far back as the 1970s. You can't also underestimate the capacity of those governments for strategic deception. In Russia, that was known as Maskirovka. And they take the idea of Sun Tzu, when you're weak, pose strong, and when you're strong, poses weak. And we saw that with the development of Soviet ballistic missile defense, the Soviet trust operation, where they created fake dissident movements. Why? To entrap the anti-Soviet resistance, break it apart, and to convince the West that communism is collapsing. And there's a lot of evidence. I'm not going to go into it at this point because that's literally another show. And
I sum it up as Russians play chess.
Yes, we do. And communists play chess. And even during the 1930s, the Nazis played chess, and the Islamists too as well. It's in their doctrine. And they use the greed. You see, you and I have been talking about, Sam Polk, the hedge fund trader, Mr. Fireball of greed. The Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Cubans, they're all very well aware of this. If I can do this on my spare time and get very little compensation for it, they have people paid to study this. They literally, intelligence services, academics, and whatnot. And you could agree, I know this might sound crackpot, And I used to believe this until I really did a deep dive in the research and it started to make sense. I mean, one of the missteps in the 1980s was what I term the Gorbachev deception, where Gorbachev had a plan, and this was admitted by Georgy Arbatov of the Institute for USA and Canada. And you probably remember this. He says, we have a terrible weapon for you Americans. We have the ability to eliminate the image of the enemy. And what even declassified Soviet documents that were leaked out, as well as defectors from the 80s, and people that I know who know have spoken to GRU defectors from Russia and SVR and FSB defectors, what they have said was there was this plan to neutralize the United States, to get us to cut defense spending, to deindustrialize and everything, in essence to lull us to a sleep. And it's not to say Russia did not have severe economic problems. I don't think they're 100 feet tall, but they're not 2 feet short, if you will. And we have to be really cognizant. These people are not stupid, these governments. I'll give you an example. In an interview in 2023, Nikolai Patrushev, who is the secretary of the Russia's Security Council and former head of the Federal Security Service, predicted here in America, ordinary citizens won't lift a finger to preserve America's unity, knowing they mean nothing to their own government. U.S. authorities, without understanding the consequences, are destroying themselves step by step. Now, people think, oh, they're just bragging. Well, let's take a look at the statistics. In 2021, only 11% of Americans say they are satisfied with the course of our nation. 66% of American adults were polled as being, quote, very dissatisfied. According to a poll from NORC at the University of Chicago, nearly a quarter of Americans find the American dream, quote, out of reach, rising from 18% in 2022 to 24%. And of course, in one of my essays I'm reading it from, in my Hard Truth of Capitalism series, I said this is clearly not the result of, quote, big government or socialism, and it is neoliberalism, aka Reaganomics or market fundamentalism. So my view is that this is not paranoia. We should not lull ourselves to sleep. We have to, it's like back in 2017, I was 200 pounds. I was carted into a hospital because I had tightness in my chest. I had almost 100% clogged coronary artery. I almost passed away. This is similar. What did I do after my divorce? I lost weight. I ate better. I took medicines and everything. A plan for improvement. The tools are there. There are so many great minds here in America, like you, Pat, for example, that can really reconstruct this country in a 10-year, 20-year period, because this is going to take a lot of time and a lot of massive reinvestment and rethinking, and in some cases, even cultural shifts in our national DNA, too, as well. This is going to be a very radical shift, but it is possible, and this has to be a Manhattan Project level commitment. And I feel very strongly about this, and this is why I'm trying to get my message out. It is so important because at the end of the day, it's not about right or left or conservative or liberal. It is about national survival. That's what it comes down to. Let's not overestimate the strength of our opponents, but let's not underestimate them, because the survival, if America is taken out of the world scene, this world is not going to be a better place. You can kiss Taiwan, South Korea, Israel goodbye. And that will be potentially a humanitarian catastrophe. Europe will be neutralized. And that's my concern. Now, I guess before I ask you questions, I'm going to ask, I guess, this follow-up questions. Do you know of any voices that out there that you have met that express concerns like me, or am I a voice in the wilderness?
No, Michael Lim, Kevin Kearns, Al Ekes, Carl van Wolferen from the Netherlands. They share all this. Part of our problem is in this is you have a handful of people that are analyzing and boring down and finding out what are the real problems and what are the sources and what are the means to, in effect, cut the Gordian knot and solve it as quickly as possible. At the same time, we have so many forces of paralysis inside this country that wish to maintain the status quo here. My views have been heard, and it's at the highest levels on it. On the other hand, the forces of statism are overwhelming in this, and in the Washington culture where I have spent the majority of my mature life, is such that you have a political industrial complex of which you have, I think at this point, 40,000 registered lobbyists. You have massive amounts of money that are put up. You have massive amounts of money that are put into political campaigns. You have people now, the Koch brothers is one group. They spend $250 million a year on their political operations. You had Elon Musk put up something close to $300 million into this last campaign. You wound up with Timothy Mellon, I think, spent close to $200 million in this campaign. It is very tough to go on a battle with a computer full of ideas against people who are putting up this kinds of money and are threatening the careers of politicians by, in effect, saying that they will primary them. So it is very tough. The opportunities come when there are crises. And so for people in the idea business, you are, I am, others are, it is to have those ideas really refined, backed up, substantiated, expressed in clear terms, set it up where politicians and others can communicate them clearly. And then when one of these major shifts occur, which is happening, one is happening right now, is to be able to get those ideas into the debates. And then at that point, when certain politicians see their careers tied to it, then they'll build the coalitions necessary to get it done. But a good part of it in those in-between years, and that's been true at least with me, is to stockpile those ideas, get them clarified, and be in a position where you can get them introduced and discussed, get them into the policy debate. And, things like this, your podcast, op-ed pieces, books, that's the way you do it.
Yeah, well, we're going to turn to Milton Friedman, who actually gave advice similar to what you're saying. He wrote in Capitalism and Freedom. He said only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And then he goes on and elaborates that in very clear terms. And he's right.
That's my experience.
Yeah. And that's, it's just, but I also say on the flip side, COVID, you would think we would have learned after the Great Recession. No. Who did Obama appoint? Larry Summers as head of the NEC, who said in 2006, we're all Milton Friedmanites now. So that was a crisis that was wasted. You had COVID, which now people are saying, I have to be careful because this is going to be on YouTube. Let's just say there's national security issues related to COVID, and I won't elaborate because I have to be very careful with what I say via YouTube.
Well, if there are not national security issues, it laid out the experience, laid out a plan how it could easily be made into one.
Exactly. So, but did we learn from COVID? No. I mean, the Trump administration, other than Operation Warp Speed, really was a tragedy. He did not take any adequate leadership with that. I think there were some good things that came out of the first Trump administration. There are a number of policies I do agree with on the flip side. One of which is that he did change the conversation on trade and on outsourcing. And now everyone is talking about it. He has mainstreamed an issue that has been marginalized in virtually every single presidential campaign since at least the 1980s. That is a huge step. Number two, you also have some of Trump's policies that were positive on trade were extended into the Biden administration and even expanded under Biden, which was a tragedy that Biden really did not speak of that, particularly with tariffs. Biden and Kamala Harris ran away from that. That was a huge mistake. And in fact, Kamala Harris's campaign, when you look at her record as Attorney General and Senator from California, it was mixed on economic issues, but she brought in a lot of the same crew from Clinton and Obama. I call them, funnily, I call them Clint-Obama because in many ways they're one and the same. She brought Tony West and Mark Cuban, and others who really I term Reaganite lights, if you will. So that was a huge mistake. She ran away from anti-price gouging legislation as fast as she could. That was a huge mistake. They really did not capture the narrative of why there was the inflation. And maybe you could elaborate on it for the audience since you have the business and the professional experience and you're an economist. But the inflation, even some corporate executives like Jamie Dimon from Chase Morgan, they all say he was praying. He does the inflation dance. He's praying for the inflation dance because he benefits from it. So what happened was a supply chain breakdown as a result of COVID, as well as also corporations figuring out that they could increase the prices of their goods, and they feel that the market, meaning the consumer market, could sustain it and take it, if you will. And that's what happened. And these companies, you look at the statistics, it's not that like they were losing money, they were massively profiting from it all across the board, in the banking, in retail, et cetera, et cetera. It was not big government and everything. And I think Kamala Harris really did not focus enough on telling that story and giving the documentation. And one of the ways you do it is repeat what the CEOs say. And I talk about it in my essay. I say, don't take my word for it. Don't take Bernie Sanders' word for it. Don't take Nevin Gussack's on somewhat of the opposite political spectrum. Don't take our words for it. Look at the Wall Street analysts. Look at the corporate executives at corporate shareholder meetings. Look at what they say even at times to the press. It's all out there. What are your thoughts about the inflation? And then we'll talk about Trump and we'll do some wrap up.
A big part of the inflation was price opportunism. You had grocery stores, you had many people that saw the breakdowns of the supply chain because of COVID as an opportunity to increase prices and profits. And basically, that was a major driving force behind all of this. Another part of it is the money that was put in to stave off a Great Depression. And again, that part of it was money well spent in the Trump and in the Biden administration. The cost of a Great Depression would be infinitely more than what this would be. To me, the opportunity of the Trump administration is with his willingness to use tariffs. Therein lies the opportunity here. The way that he and Peter Navarro are talking about using tariffs at this point is as a as a weapon to do stop drug flows, stop immigration flows, etc. That in itself is a suboptimal use. I mean, the major challenge is this clash between types of tax systems, direct tax versus indirect tax. Quite literally, the thing that is killing the U.S. industrial base and our exports is increasing our dependency, economically, national security on foreign made goods, is this inappropriate response that we have to the VAT tax. What I will be urging is that, quite literally, is that Trump apply a tariff equal to the amount of the VAT that foreign governments apply as a de facto tariff on our exports. So it would be 19% for Germany, 20% for France, 22% for China. I mean, for Italy, 15% for China, et cetera. You know, whatever that VAT level that they do. Yes, create a trade war. And yes, use our market as a leverage. But unless we end these massive tariffs against our exports and the massive subsidies on the competitive goods that foreign countries send here, we're going to have literally a fully hollowed out industrial economy in this thing. So, yeah, Trump's willingness to use tariffs creates an enormous opportunity to correct a 50-year mistake that we've accepted in the global trade system.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of opportunities that are lying around, but I do think it is going to take a crisis or even a massive catastrophe to bring us in order, but God willing, our country survives. There's a tremendous amount of human capital. As you pointed out in a number of interviews and lectures, the American people, there's definitely an inventiveness and a resilience and an innovation streak in here to think outside the box. There's a tremendous amount of human capital that's still left in everyday citizens and business and labor in both parties.
It's the best in the world, period.
Yeah.
We're the most innovative country in the world, still are.
Yeah, I mean, still, you know, I hate to plug my family. I mean, someone like my father, I mean, he has patented different inventions, my grandfather on my father's side. And, like Elon Musk, I have very mixed views on him. There are things I virulently disagree with him, but at the core, I don't have an issue with the goods and services he produces, as long as they're safe and consumers want them and we're able to export them based on product quality. I do believe in trade or theoretical free trade in the sense based on product, as I point out in my papers, product quality. That's what I believe. The problem is that trade, the way it's been conducted for half a century, if not more, really historically, is not solely based on product quality. It's based on non-free market, non-product interventions by foreign governments in this case. I have no issue with people being billionaires. This is where I separate from Bernie Sanders, which even his own tax plans, his business side insider documented, doesn't actually abolish billionaires. And let me tell you, from this side of the aisle, that's a good thing. I don't necessarily want to get rid of billionaires. Just because somebody makes $1 billion, and if they use what you term the old stakeholder model or pre-Reagan or Keynesian model of capitalism, where they're investing in good products, their labor, as long as the company is profitable, and as long as you provide decent working conditions, if need be, in partnership with local, federal, and state governments, I don't care how much money that is. It's all about how you make your money. It's not if you make your money or how much.
And what you do with it.
Exactly. That's what it comes down to. And that's what separates me from the far left of various stripes, as well as people who espouse socialism. Now, concerning The inflation, again, to back up your assertions, and this is more for the audience, JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon stated to President Biden that, quote, we need a Marshall Plan for U.S. and European energy security. Today, oil companies are under enormous pressure from Wall Street to return cash to shareholders through dividends and buybacks instead of investing in badly needed supply. And this is where I disagree with the conservative right and the libertarian right. They're saying, oh, it's because Biden is anti-energy. That's only a part of the story, but the bigger part of the picture is in investment strategies here. I continue. An executive from an oil field services firm told the Dallas Federal Reserve, discipline continues to dominate the industry. Shareholders and lenders continue to demand a return on capital, and until it becomes unavoidably obvious that high energy prices will sustain, there will be no exploration spending. A Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas survey claimed that 59% of oil company CEOs, executives claimed that Wall Street investor pressure to maintain capital discipline was the primary reason publicly traded oil producers restrained growth. And I could read on and on all these different quotes. And I reference, of course, ironically, that Jamie Dimon is saying that, look, I'm praying for I like inflation. He said, I don't look at a recession as a bad thing. I mean, it's bad for America. It's bad for the people that are unemployed. It's usually an opportunity for JP Morgan. And he says he prays to do the inflation dance. So when you look at this, it's like you look at the facts versus the campaign rhetoric, there's a real disconnect. And the reason why I read these quotes, I know you know this, Pat, but many in the audience do not know. They're not aware. The average person is not aware. And I have a feeling the major news networks do not cover it.
Well, it's basically guys like you and I spend a major part of our lives studying stuff like that. People who are interested and have a patriotic tent wind up making a living. I mean, that's what I do all day. You're in a library, you're at the original source material on it. That's why podcasts such as yours are important to bring you and bring guests to share these ideas, the results of these studies and investigation. I mean, that's our role. And thank goodness for people that are intrigued enough, intellectually curious enough to watch your podcast and use this as a learning experience, or at least as an experience that will direct them to other readings where they can make up their own mind.
Well, exactly. And also your books. I mean, it's kind of there's kind of a circulation in the system because your books have helped inspire me and have guided me along with many other authors in the right direction too, as well as assembling facts from simply newspapers and journals. And and the other thing, I think economists and people on the right, as well as also the Democratic Party, exceptions, of course, naturally, there's a real disconnect, and I've been reflecting on this as I listen to arguments about economics. There's a real disconnect between what the economists say, particularly quote unquote free market economists, and to a degree, even socialist economists, when they're talking about the quote actual socialist countries and lived experience. Again, a disconnect between the economists who trot out all these statistics and charts versus lived experience by the people experiencing the system. And I know you kind of, in one of our conversations, said you kind of left the official associations of economists.
No, I was never a member.
Oh, you were never a member. I thought you were like
no.
Oh, okay.
In my 20s, I was a member of the American Economics Association. And I thought that quite literally my profession had become enthralled with mathematics and was spent more time on trying to define a coefficient that could explain it and were ignoring what was plainly right in their face. That Thorstein Veblen was right. It's the institutions that matter. You cannot you cannot make the kinds of assumptions that we're generally made and believe that they are going to be a steady state. You can take a look at the way it is, but is the how the institutions function uh, that is essential, and that's been my approach. So, uh,
Yeah,
I
I take the institutionalists and the historical school of
right,
economic analysis. When I took Econ 101 and 102, look, I had a very good professor at Florida Atlantic University at the time. And but one of the things, and I was still largely a free market guy at that point, and I still walked away and I said, this is such counterintuitive information and assumptions, it didn't make sense to me. It's like I had to like force my mind against its better judgment to understand concepts that just didn't make intuitively sense. And to me, I usually like to utilize intuition and what's in front of me and what's happening in front of me as a guidebook to actually making decisions. Ideally, not always, I'm not always like that, but I try to, and certainly to analyze the world around me. And that was my experience in taking 2 econ classes. It was just, some of it had truth, but a lot of it was, much of the material was just like, oh my God, it's like, and then when I have commentators like, let's say like a free market guy like Ben Shapiro or Matt Walsh or and others that say, oh, go to econ, or Richard Hanania, I don't know if you know his work. They say, oh, Econ 101, and they'll say, oh, you don't know anything about econ economics, or oh, open the Econ 101 textbook. I can't tell you, Pat, how much contempt there is from, sadly, the free market economist community towards people that dissent from their views. It almost belies their commitment to, quote, freedom. There's such an intolerance. Do you have any comments about what I just said?
absolutely. I mean, you've got it right. I've always said to young people that studies go into Amazon, go onto the internet, and buy a copy of Principles of Economics by W. Nelson Peach. It was the uh, textbook for the country in the 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s. It's institutional economics. It comes out of Thorstein Veblen, etc. The other thing I say to people about my own books is go to Amazon, go to eBay, go to other sources, and buy it used. You can buy good books for 50 cents, dollar and a half, plus shipping cost. It unless you just want a new book and want to spend the extra money. Uh, uh, Most of what is worthwhile reading, that or Carol von Wolfram's The Enigma of Japanese Power, or Chalmers Johnson, MIDI, which is about MIDI. These books can be bought for next to nothing, and they will give a different perspective. In the economics profession, you wind up with so many economists boarded by institutes that are founded by billionaires, the Koch brothers, and a whole series of others,
Yes.
and they're not hired unless they have that ideological filter on what they're doing. And in many of the economics departments, they're financed in part not only by the university, but by grants that are given by the Koch brothers and others. And again, if your work does not adhere to the philosophy of the donors, you're let go and you're not hired. Uh, Economists in these circumstances are hired because they believe the same ideology. I mean, it's not that they're prostituting themselves. They actually believe this and they're taught this. and you have peer relationships uh, with each other, always leading up to the ultimate prize, the Nobel Prize in economics. And so they're going for prizes, they're going for grant money, etc. And uh, that really loads the dice. And you perceived it, obviously, when you were studying principles of economics, and you see that disdain. In my case, I'm old. I've had a long career. I've got up on C-SPAN. There's 41 uh, appearances. A goodly part of those are me in debates with other economists, etc. And if you're willing to just go to the facts, not put it through an ideological uh, filter, you'll come out with workable solutions. That's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. And I see that disdain a lot more so in social media. And it's just, I feel like you're not going to convert a lot of these people, and they have to learn on their own.
Yep.
And you have people that leave that worldview for various different reasons. Now, concerning grants, there's a very good report. It's available, publicly available by Alan C. Brownfeld, titled Japan's Economic Power in the United States, the Invisible Hand, issued in November 1989 by the U.S. Industry Council's Educational Foundation.
Right.
And it talked about how Citizens for a Sound Economy, which was then, and I think it still exists now, which was a Koch brothers funded and controlled organization. It received donations from American Honda, Toyota Motor Sales USA, Mazda Motors of America, and Nissan Motors Corporation in the USA. The Heritage Foundation received funds, this is during the 1980s, from Far Eastern Textiles Limited, the Federation of Korean Industries, and the Taiwan Cement Corporation. So you have state as well as state-subsidized corporations also giving these monies and grants to these think tanks. And do you think they're just going to, there's no string attached? I mean,
Yeah.
really?
Well, that's why in my works I've always insisted that people identify the source of their funding. My position is the source of their livelihood may or may not affect their view, but the reader or the listener needs to understand it. This is in '92. It's one of the reasons I got into the controversy of Japanese influence in the political party. We went into the '92 election, and the chairman of the Republican Party was Frank Fahrenkopf. Fahrenkopf was the lobbyist for Toyota. And on the Democratic side, it was Ron Brown, who was the lobbyist for the Japanese Electronics Association. So, my point was, it's going to be very difficult for two guys who made their living from Japan being fairly objective when they dealt with trade policy with Japan and then their advice inside the Democratic Party. And that just is just sort of standard operation at this point. You have 200 former members of Congress that are now foreign agents, foreign lobbyists inside this country.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. So moving forward, what do you see? Where do you see the Trump administration going forward? Do you have any predictions on policy directions they're going to go, despite my concerns that you and I discussed?
I hope we're going to rethink our war strategies and weapon systems out of the Department of Defense. I think that is going to happen. I think once again, it's happened with George W. Bush, the viability of the Social Security and medical system are going to be examined. And again, I think it's going to eventually drive, if not in this administration, it's going to set the basis for the next, to set another Greenspan type of commission, talk about the viability of the system. Social Security is going to run out of money. And I think the latest estimate is 2035, 11 years from now. And at that point, it can only pay 70% of the benefits. Between now and then, what will happen, I think, is you'll have a commission, and fundamentally, they'll raise the cap on FICA taxes, and so it'll be financed, and it'll be very painful. I think there's a good possibility that process will start now. What we're also going to have is a fight about the Department of Education and other functions, and the fight is going to be useful. I'd rather not have it, but it will be useful because it will affirm and make some changes, but it will affirm with a changed system many of these programs and provide a political basis for them to continue on for a couple of generations as such. Every now and then it's good to take a look, seeing what you're doing, see if there's any changes that be made. That's going to happen. For Trump, the bounds of this are going to be set by television. In other words, what's popular or not. He's going to do nothing to lose his base because that's everything to him, as it should be politically. And second, it's going to be Wall Street. Some of his trade and other policies. If he makes big changes, it will affect Wall Street and his investors and the people that finance his campaigns. So he will make changes on that. He was against TikTok until I had a major investor in TikTok gave a lot of money. He's was against many of the things that Elon Musk was until Musk gave money, etc. I mean, Trump is transactional.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Trump era is going to be chaotic, but there's going to be an examination of programs, and American people are going to have a chance to see if they want them or not. And if the Republicans go too far, they'll lose control of the House and Senate at midterm. So, I mean, it's a dynamic system that is self-correcting.
Yeah, I think that sounds about spot on. Now, moving forward to concluding with solutions, what are your solutions to repair the American economy? I'm going to run down a list like what we did in our conversations before. First of all, what I would do, and I would do this gradually so to avoid too painful of a shock to the system, because it's like basically getting a drug addict or a drunk patient cured, and you don't want to do cold turkey in less than a 24-hour period. Otherwise, it's going to create severe damage. So what I would do is I would start within to be achieved, let's say, in a 5-year period.
Okay.
I would convene what I term a commission to dereganize and declintonize the economy and go through every instance of deregulation and see what we can re-regulate if need be and what we can keep deregulated. I would make within a 5-year period stock buybacks illegal, which used to be illegal before 1982. I would also take a look at our tax system with the loopholes. My guidebook is as low as possible and as high as needed. That is my tax policy in a nutshell. I would avoid Marxist as well as supply side dogmas in constructing tax policy. And I would take a look at closing the overseas loopholes through the tax harmonization strategies that the George W. Bush notably opposed, and Dick Armey and others. I would look at taxing more quote unquote speculation as opposed to production and work. I would restore, as part of my commission to dereganize and declintonize the economy, to restore laws like the Banking Act, known as Glass-Steagall, and Regulation Q, and others that make lending and banking much more conservative and investment more conservative and careful and prudent. I would also take a look at potentially nationalizing the Federal Reserve into the third national bank of the United States in good Hamiltonian style. And I would allow it as, of course, it would continue to regulate the money supply, but it would also disperse lower no interest loans or credits to industries that are either dormant or struggling to revitalize them, where certain strict preferences put into place in developing the best products as possible and not to subsidize inefficiency. It would also subsidize and create infrastructure. There's a lot of dredging projects in my home area, the greater New York City area, high-speed rail, and others that need to be implemented immediately. I'm just doing economics and not national security. That could be a different show. Fourthly, I would use the Third National Bank as well as a progressive implementation of tariffs over at least a 10-year period to achieve a average tariff rate, which is currently 2% now. Now I would increase it within at least a 10-year period to 25%, which used to be the average level from 1789 to about the 1940s after World War II. I would also take a look at eliminating slowly but surely as the market share develops for domestic industries again, eliminate the loopholes in the Buy American laws, which President Eisenhower and then Carter implemented many loopholes in. I would slowly close those loopholes as well. I would also enact the PRO Act, and I would basically declare right to work, which is a part of the Taft-Hartley Act. I would make that unconstitutional or illegal. Right to work would be abolished because there needs to be a rebalancing of labor and capital to stabilize the system and to really truly allow people to save, to invest, to spend without taking out all sorts of loans and credit cards and everything else. I mean, I'm saying this to the audience, for years, studies have shown that people cannot even afford, I think it was 60% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency, for example. And I think the number is even greater for a $1,000 emergency. That is not an issue of people just being merely irresponsible with their earnings, which I think a lot of people on the right, particularly the free market right, as well as even the Larry Summers type of crowd would say. That is not the case. The cost of goods and services have increased exponentially compared to wages and salaries. I don't even understand why that's in dispute. And again, that goes back to that clash between what economists say versus what the lived experience of the vast majority of Americans are. There's a lot I would do, but those are some items off the top of my head. Get rid of right to work. I don't know. I'm not reading it from my policy statements that I have in my essays. This is just off the top of my head. The whole point of this is not to penalize wealth, but it's to incentivize wealth creation and what I term the 6 sources of national wealth that I went over earlier in the show. That is mining, manufacturing, agriculture, R&D, education, and transportation/infrastructure. That's the whole purpose of this project. Yes, it's to massage the income and wealth inequality that is out of control, but more importantly, it's to incentivize personal wealth for people across the board. And also what I would do is also, by the way, a couple of more items, by the way, speaking of personal wealth. I would also, in the public schools, I would also redo the curriculum according to certain national standards insofar as not only patriotic education that's spoken of truth, but also home economics classes, basics in car repair, basics in balancing checkbooks and personal finances and things of that nature, civics classes, which, by the way, Reagan and George W. Bush, especially under No Child Left Behind, defunded quite a bit of that. You know, the patriotic Reagan and George Bush. You know those two guys. Um, so I would also I would also work with that and develop tuition-free college education for certain majors to incentivize our talent pool of young engineers, scientists, computer sciences, teaching, biology majors, chemistry majors. This way they can have the incentive to go into those majors and then graduate, go into these new and redeveloping industries and work in developing new products and services. And I would also wean ourselves off very slowly. This is going to be a very difficult process, but wean ourselves off of trade partners that either are geopolitical adversaries or, frankly, countries that are governed with massive human rights violations like Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and communist China. I mean, have decoupled from Russia, thankfully. Not a lot of people know this, but we imported a lot of steel from Russia, uranium, oil, and gas, and we had to decouple. And part of the rising prices in oil and gas was a result of that. But the good news is that we have domestic oil reserves and gas reserves, as well as renewable energies that we can tap. And that's where eliminating stock buybacks and other perverse incentives here for financialization, we eliminate that by public law, and it will incentivize, if not force, companies not to not make money, but to make money through actually producing and extracting goods and minerals and resources. And I would also take a look at, by congressional resolution, invalidating the Supreme Court's decisions from Buckley versus Vallejo all the way to McCutcheon. I would put a ban on foreign lobbying by Americans. If you're a chairperson of the Republican or Democratic parties, it should be illegal for you to lobby for any government. I don't care if I like them or I don't like them. You want to lobby for Israel and you hold a public office or a political position or a military position or a position in any political party, that should be illegal. In fact, even private citizens, I mean, yes, you can work for a Japanese auto company in the United States, fine, producing the products. But if you're lobbying for these countries, and especially if you're a former federal official or the chairperson of the Republican or Democratic parties, that should be illegal. So those are some starters. What are your views concerning that? And anything you'd like to add?
Overwhelmingly, I agree with virtually all of those. Those are radical changes. The question that we face is what changes could we make that would serve the purpose of cutting a Gordian knot? Well, the first thing is I would go back to the whole question of financing our campaigns. I would literally not permit unlimited money, dark money, etc. I would own our presidential races. I would have them financed publicly. I'd try to limit the campaigns to a shorter period of time, give a lot of public access to the media. So we don't want our president beholden. So that's the first thing. Same thing with our Congress. I'd totally close the revolving door between public office and private lobbying. As such, there are plenty of people who have not been in government, that will never go to government, that are effective advocates who can make the case. But if you're a member of Congress, I'm sorry, you cannot be a lobbyist when you leave. So I'd do that. So I'd focus on the institution. So the institution, you can bring other solutions and they can be fairly evaluated. So that'd be the first thing. Second thing, I'd go to the financial system and I would put in Glass-Steagall again. And then on the private capital, on the funds, I would, let's take your 5-year parameter. I would literally tax short-term gains. I would have a tax system that on short-term gains, I would just illustrative. But for the first year you sold, you'd pay 50%, second year 40, 30, 20, and then down to 10. In other words, I would encourage investors, these major funds, to think longer term rather than a quick, half-hour profit on speculation in terms. And so I would deal with that. As far as the general population, I would have state universities that would offer quite literally tuition free, that subsidize the books, the learning materials, the tuition. I would cancel that. I went to college in a period in which I paid no tuition, University of Texas system. And the country gained such benefits. The last thing we want is people indentured for the rest of their lives. So I would start with those things. I would add one other thing. I would impose a tariff equal to the VAT rate that is charged on American exports abroad. I would love one stroke, and you can level the playing field on global trade.
Yeah, or we could institute our own VAT, which the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where their research has indicated that it is even WTO compatible. And this is where we would have to establish, if I were president, let's say and I would have to run as an independent, obviously. I would commission a brain trust similar to FDR, and I would get people from the following organizations: you, Michael Lind. I would get some of my national security people like Jared Nyquist and Trevor Loudon and others. I would bring forth personnel from the Alliance for American Manufacturing, of Scott Paul's group. I would bring some elements of the Economic Policy Institute, Matt Stoller, some of the people from American Affairs. I would bring, I would bring a whole bunch of different people, Orrin Cass of American Compass. Now, the big question, of course, is would I include the free market or market fundamentalists and libertarians? I would talk to them because they have certain good ideas that can be put to use for efficient government. But I would be very skeptical of keeping them in a permanent coalition. Why? Because I hate to say it, but because of the damage that their ideas have done to our national security and what I term the shared but earned prosperity model that used to exist in this country. But I would have open conversations in the spirit of civility and free speech and free exchange of ideas with most people within the mainstream for the most part. But when it comes to permanent coalition building, these are voices on the right, the left, and the center whose ideas are not only well documented, but have proved to have worked at some point in our country's history. In the defense side, I would put people like General Breedlove. I would put General John Adams, who is in Florida. He has done some work. He was a brigadier general in the U.S. Air Force and has really raised a hue and a cry about supply chain issues. He was involved with the Alliance for American Manufacturing. I would bring them into the fore. I would bring Philip Breedlove, who is very pro-NATO and very concerned of Russia. I would put him into the fray. I would bring in, there are some other names that are escaping me right now, but these are people that have historic concerns about the rise of China and Russia, and I would, as well as supply chains, bring them in. And I would bring in, frankly, members of the business community in here. I would bring folks like Nick Hanauer, for example, in my in advisory or administrative roles. I would look through the Rolodex of folks in the CPA, the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and the Alliance for Manufacturing. I would bring these executives in, people like Dan D'Amico, who's the chairman emeritus of Nucor Steel. There are a lot of executives that are fairly wealthy that I would bring in because I want the business sense and the enterprise culture in there that is critical in government. But this sort of slash and burn, libertarianism or Reaganomics or Clintonomics that focuses on short term. It's kind of like taking cocaine. If man, not that I've ever tried it, but man, it feels great. And I feel such a high and I feel super confident. And then what happens? And then you feel like crap afterwards. And then you get an addiction, and it rots your body. It's like all the opioids and whatnot. It's the same thing. So instead of that short-term profit focus of public policy, I would look at, as you said, long-term profits, long-term development and whatnot. So I bring these people in, and that would be a permanent member of my coalition. It would cross into the labor unions or elements of the labor union. It would cross into business. It would be brought into academics and elements of the reform, which party, the Democratic and Republican parties. It would be what I term transpartisan, if you will. It cuts across partisan lines. And some libertarians, I would talk to them. Would I talk to obviously extremist groups, including like what I would term extremists as Democratic Socialists of America? No, because my long-term goals are so different than theirs that even though we might agree with the diagnosing the problem, their long-term solutions is just so anathema that really I could not in good faith bring in what is colloquially termed the tankies, which are Marxist-Leninist groups, or Democratic Socialist America, or neo-fascists. Because, look, I've read their works and whatnot. I've had even a few contact me because they confused my old show, Populist Patriot. I had to rename my show because of this, because I was getting emails and communications. Oh, you're a populist. And then I find that their politics are so diametrically opposed. It's like, look, I'll talk to people and learn from them, but when it comes to permanent policy making, you have to draw the line in certain areas. So that would be basically the blueprint for my administration: developing a brain trust, a government in waiting, a sort of shadow cabinet where
that's totally possible. When I was involved in the NAFTA, basically the whole decade of the 1990s, on NAFTA, joined the World Trade Organization, China's ascension into the WTO. A group of us formed a coalition, and we called ourselves the No Name Group. And basically, there were about 40 groups, 40 individuals. And we would meet at least once a month, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a month. And basically, these are people that you would not think about associating. They were from left, right, center, think tanks, ideology, etc., independent authors. And basically, what we would do is discuss out issues and come to agreements. That's why you saw such odd combinations of opponents to NAFTA, WTO. That traces directly to that. So what you're saying is very not only possible, but it's easy to do in Washington. The second thing is the good news is the Democratic Party is now in a process of rethinking what they are, what they stand for, who they represent, what they should be doing in the future. It's going to be a big opportunity there to introduce new ideas into it. The moment this Trump administration ends in 48, 49 months, there's going to be the same thing. The moment that Donald Trump exits the scene politically, it is going to be a party that has to redefine themselves, because they define themselves now around Trump and his policies. And so you're going to have a second opportunity. This is historic. This happens maybe once every half century, every century, and both parties are going to be rethinking. So advancing ideas, thinking it through, building coalitions. Next I'd say 7, 8 years are going to be really exciting. There's real opportunities here.
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. And as we talked about before, there are forces that are congealing together uh, that could make this possible. The flame has not been extinguished, and that is the good news. The question is when is it going to be our turn to basically re-affect policy? And there's a part of me.
We got to involve ourselves right now, involve
Yeah.
ourselves in Democrats. I mean, basically, the operating philosophy that I believe is to say anybody is interested in the policies that I'm interested in, then I'm happy to work with them. I don't care, left, right, radical, passive, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're working these policies, let's work it out.
And, that's exactly my approach to radical civic nationalism and developing a voter base. It could cross from your transgendered, purple-haired person, but if they are, let's say, hostile to communism and fascism, and they're opposed to Reaganomics and they're civic nationalists, same thing with a Christian. Let me tell you something, man. I'll take a transgender purple-haired woman who is anti-CCP and anti-Putin to, let's say, Pat Robertson, yes, I'm naming names, who was very much against dumping by China and the Soviet Union. When he ran in 1988 in the Republican primary, you remember this, and he was against Reagan's appeasement of Gorbachev, but then somehow he became a proponent of MFN and PNTR for communist China, which now you follow the money. It was admitted that TBN Broadcasting got entry into the market in China. So, who would I rather take? Brianna Wu, who is transgender woman, a man who transitioned to a woman, who takes the side of Israel, rightly or wrongly, takes a firm stand on her Twitter X page against communism, but is for common sense, populist, progressive forms, while explicitly being in favor of capitalism and against anti-capitalism, versus a Christian, God-fearing patriot who speaks about all those great themes you and I might agree with in some form or another, but sells us out by clinching deals and legitimizing the butchers in Beijing. So and I'm going to upset a lot of my conservative viewers when I say that, but I have to be, and they know some of this already, but you have to be genuine about this. This is smart coalition building, because what is this all about? It's not about religion. It's not about ideology. It's not about your gender or whatever. It's about national survival. You got to keep your eyes on the prize and avoid the distractions. And look at what I've termed on a previous show that I used to be a regular guest, Rick and Beck of WEI, Make the Call. We talked about this all the time. I termed it the rhetoric versus the reality. Always distinguish between the two. One other item I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is healthcare. We see the, I will say, tragic death of Brian Thompson. Look, I don't like the health insurance model of industry because, again, as by big pharma and health insurance executives has said over and over again, as well as healthcare executives who turn whistleblower like Wendell Potter, they all talk about their business model is enhancing shareholder value as opposed to fulfilling the patient needs while still being profitable. Look, do I have sympathy for Thompson's model and business strategy? No, I don't. This is not the killing of Mother Teresa or George Washington or Mahatma Gandhi. But I am equally disturbed, though, by the general anti-capitalism from all sides of the political equation celebrating his death. And that's going to upset my more populist or liberal or left-wing viewers when I say that as well, because I look at the history, and anti-capitalism taken to an extreme leads to the rise of dictatorships that prove to be just as corrupt, very authoritarian, and even genocidal, that leaves marks on citizens who have lived through those experiences. I mean, my good friend My good friend John, his grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Two ex-girlfriends of mine were from Venezuela and Cuba. A Republican Senate candidate, Mary Elena Stewart, who was originally from Cuba, suffered tremendously, her and her family, to the point of physical injuries from communism in Cuba, blows to her head and suffering brain injuries. What I find from people that come from these countries, I'm not trying to sound disrespectful, there is psychological impacts on these people. They're very they're good people, but there's a level of distrust. There's a level of, I don't want to say paranoia, and it's very sad. So I don't want that for our countrymen. So that's why I'm concerned about that rise for anti-capitalism. But I think Elizabeth Warren is right. This does come from a place of legitimate anger. It's not entirely misplaced. And I think the right wing is being unfair to her and mischaracterizing her views, because Elizabeth Warren, agree or disagree with her background, she started out like I was. She was part of the whole law and property movement when she was politically formative. She was supportive of laissez-faire economics. And she made a change in the 1990s when she looked at the evidence as a lawyer, if I recall correctly, and was shocked. It shocked her to her core and deeply upset her. And that caused her to shift. And she still wants to stabilize capitalism. That's at least her stated intention. So I look at this with healthcare. I started to look off and on why, and I had some personal experience during my near heart attack situation, where what happened is my cardiologist at the time said Nevin has to go to Broward General in downtown Fort Lauderdale. He needs a stent put in there. United Healthcare, which generally has treated me very well, by the way, overall, knock on wood, and their service staff at the Broward County Government Center, their liaisons, because that's who we're covered by, are absolutely amazing professionals. But United Healthcare would not cover the ambulance costs. They wanted me to do the stent installation inpatient as an outpatient. And my cardiologist at the time, who's retired, said, like hell, that's going to happen. I'm going to basically say, if something happens, I'm going to tell Nevin's ex-wife that if Nevin passes away or develops complications, I'm going to give Nevin's ex-wife a number for some lawyers and seek redress. Within an hour, they paid for the inpatient surgical procedure. So that started to change my views, and I started to look, and I asked myself, why? So I started to trace it back, and I wanted you to add some information on this. It seemed like it was in different stages. It started in the 1970s, and particularly in the 1980s, when supposedly insurance companies used to be, and correct me if I'm wrong in the audience as well as Pat, nonprofit entities. And Nixon, and particularly Reagan and his successors, started to undo that. Apparently, there were federal subsidies for HMOs that kept them somehow nonprofit, and Reagan took that away, and I'm sure his successors, and with overall financialization of the economy, that changed. So I think as a starting point, what could be done, and I'm not an expert on this, is to at least take a hard look of what went wrong and either pursue two things. Number one, keep the private insurance, but make them nonprofit entities again. Or two, go for Medicare for all, not full socialized medicine, but Medicare for all, where the providers of medicine remain privatized, but the payment system is federalized with certain, cost efficiencies that are very strict built into it.
Right.
What went wrong with healthcare in the United States? What's the history, and how would you repair it?
Well, I'd start off with the numbers. And the numbers are that we're paying almost 18% of our gross domestic product for healthcare. And yet, when we take a look at the quality of healthcare, if you're middle class or upper middle class, if you can afford health insurance or if you've got money, you have the absolute best health care in the world. On the other hand, if you do not have insurance, what we wind up with is a bifurcated society with a major part of our people that have healthcare outcomes that are similar to what you find in developing countries. Awful, awful healthcare. Uh, High mortality rates for babies, high and or low lifespans, far less than what it would be. So the first thing is to say this is not an issue of money. This country is paying massive amounts of money. It is also to say, when you look at other countries where their gross domestic product will be 10 to 12%, and have across the board better health care than we do, it is to say there are a lot of models out there. There's a lot of practices out there to draw upon. So the first thing I would say is the challenge is to set a national goal, and that national goal is to say, look, we want a healthcare system in this country that gives the best service in the world. We want to equal what the Swiss and the Germans, the French, the Japanese have. We want that level of across the board results. And then the second thing is to go in and say, okay, our healthcare system has been built as a mishmash over time. Part of it has been the resistance by the medical profession, part of it by the insurance companies, part of it by the politics of having Medicare and not Medicaid, not having a Medicaid. I think we still have 10 states that don't have Medicaid. Point. So you go in and get those examples and you set the goal. And that goal is 10, 11, 12% of GDP and high quality. And so then the question is to reverse engineer and find out what that is. One thing that becomes, I think, fairly clear is to go in and take a look at the insurance industry as such and say, do we need an insurance system that is shared risk and that is nonprofit, that is sustainable? And on healthcare, I think that has to be considered as an option in dealing with it, and then leaving to private the companies to actually provide the healthcare. But I don't know the solution. I do know that if we start with the numbers and set the goal and then reverse engineer, that we can get there on this. I would bundle all of this together. I'd bundle it with the financing of Medicare, the financing of Social Security, and healthcare reform in one package, and realize this is a political nest of vipers that you're going to be dealing with. It's going to be very controversial. But what we have now is not really sustainable. And our healthcare is not what it could or should be.
Do you think Churchill was right when he reputedly or supposedly said in 1947 that Americans will keep on doing the right thing until everything else fails? I have a bad feeling about that he was possibly right. That's what I'm afraid of.
And that's what I think it is in this case. Look, we're a big, rich country. We're going to stay rich. We need to save our industrial base, but we're an innovative people. We're good people by and large. And so we just need to take on some of these issues. We need to remove some of the corruption in our political system, and that's driven by the way the Supreme Court has allowed things to be financed in the political system. All of this is doable, and we're going to have two opportunities to shape the political system. Probably the last time it'll happen in all of our lifetimes. Old as I am, middle age as you are, and younger, on the voters, but the Democratic Party is going to be reformed right now, coming up, and it'll happen with the exit of Trump. Now's the time to do something.
Mm-hmm. And I think the Republican Party is going to transform too. I had a broadcaster who is he's a student at Georgetown University, JP Viesmeal, and he's a Trumpist, but he has a lot of ideas in common with you and I. I think we have to have cross-political conversations. I don't think we should have Democratic Party derangement syndrome or Trump derangement syndrome. I think people of goodwill need to talk to each other. And JP is very young. He's a South Florida native. Parents are from Venezuela. He's from Venezuela. Said a lot of the same things we do. He was on the Young Turks program, and he was one of the people I reached out, and he happily came on my show. We had a very long but great conversation. And the younger voices in the Republican Party that take this sort of new right position, if you want to term it that, that's more in line with the American system of economics. I think it's going to be two things. I think it's going to require a generational shift, and this could take a half a century at most. I think it's going to require a generational shift. It's also going to require some body blows to this country. I don't know, on the geopolitical and or economic fronts, that's going to force us to learn, as you said, a major catastrophe. It breaks my heart to say that, but I think that's what's probably going to take it, where people are going to be so outraged that they're going to be galvanized to action. What the catastrophe could be is anyone's guess. I have some theories, but that's what it's going to take. Those two things. I compare it to, if you're a fan of the Rocky movies, like take Rocky 3 with Mr. T and Sylvester Stallone. Right. And Rocky got his butt kicked. Head blows, everything, catastrophe. What did he do? He wanted that prize, and he got better. And he was able to beat Clubber Lang, played by Mr. T. And he was able to do that, but it took hospitalizations, if I recall from the movie, right, and a lot of rest and a lot of training to get better. And I think I compare the United States to that, very loosely speaking.
Well, I mean, our basics and our fundamentals are right. And again, coming back to the policy shift, people that are pursuing policies, lay the ideas out there. They're not Republican ideas, they're not Democrat ideas. It's a cafeteria. Lay the ideas out, and whoever takes it, it's theirs. Period.
Yeah, that kind of, and that reminds me, I quoted, you probably have met him. You probably were personally friends with him, for all I know, Lane Kirkland, the late the AFL-CIO. He actually had a very, very good statement, and we'll do some concluding remarks afterwards. And he talked exactly about what you were just saying about, it's never just about, the conservative versus liberal. And he said in 1986, in an article critical of the Reagan administration's contradictions, and what is the objective meaning of the word conservative when its leadership has brought us a $200 billion annual deficit, put forward a measure that will mindlessly gut our defense forces year after year? I think it was referring to Grand Rudman. And now, in the wake of Geneva, escorts clamoring hordes of businessmen east in pursuit of Moscow gold, exposing to that evil empire the soft underbelly of freedom, the stateless avarice of capital. We ought not to waste too much time worrying about which category they ought to fit. There may be a few pure liberals and pure conservatives about who march in lockstep, but I don't really know any. The great rank and file of the American people are liberal about some things and conservative about others, and the shifting distribution of such impulses depends largely upon circumstances and interests. That is the way it should be, because there really are things one ought to be conservative about and things one ought to be liberal about, and they do change. And the other thing, to sum up, I think, both of our beliefs, was Franklin Roosevelt, when he said in his speech, "In our political ambitions, we are individualists, but in our seeking for economic and political progress as a nation, we all go up or else all go down as one people." That's my concluding remarks. Do you have any concluding remarks?
No, I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope your listeners and viewers have enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, Pat, I'd love to have you back in the
Oh,
coming months or coming years on our show. I think we could have a lot to talk about. You've been a wonderful wealth of knowledge, even in our private conversations in this show. I've learned about things that I didn't know before, like I do from all my other guests. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to a continued fruitful collaboration.
thank you, and so do I.
Okay. All righty. Now I got to do the stop recording thing. So, let's see.